In 1901, a British Army officer and amateur archaeologist named Herbert Weld-Blundell acquired a small clay prism from antiquities dealers operating in the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia. The object, barely 38 centimeters in height, was covered on all four sides with the dense wedge-shaped impressions of Sumerian cuneiform script. Weld-Blundell donated the artifact to the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford University, where it was catalogued as item WB444 and began attracting the sustained attention of ancient language specialists. When translators decoded the prism's full content, they encountered a document unlike anything previously known in the archaeological record. The Weld-Blundell Prism preserves what scholars now call the Sumerian King List, an ancient chronicle that divides human rulership into two completely different categories, separated by a single catastrophic event, a great flood that destroyed the known world. The kings who ruled before the flood present a chronological problem that conventional scholarship has never satisfactorily resolved. The document records 10 rulers who governed the earliest Sumerian cities before the deluge struck, and it assigns each of these monarchs a reign that modern historians classify as biologically impossible. The first king, Alulim, of the city of Eridu, is recorded as having ruled for 28,800 years. His successor, Alalgar, governed for 36,000 years. The pattern continues through 10 antediluvian rulers whose combined reigns total 241,200 years. Then the flood came, and when the waters receded, the lifespans dropped to figures that seem merely extraordinary rather than impossible. Post-flood rulers are credited with centuries, not millennia. Traditional scholarship dismisses these figures as mythological exaggeration, symbolic representation, or scribal convention entirely disconnected from historical reality. But this explanation encounters a profound difficulty. The numbers are not random. They are not the product of creative mythological invention. When examined mathematically, the antediluvian reigns reveal a structure of extraordinary precision, every figure a perfect multiple of a specific Sumerian unit of time measurement, organized according to astronomical cycles that modern science has only recently come to understand. What the Sumerian King List actually preserves, the evidence suggests, may be something far more sophisticated than myth. It may be an encoded record of an actual historical period, calculated according to a cosmic timekeeping system whose implications challenge everything conventional archaeology believes about the capabilities of prehistoric civilization. If this evidence challenges what you thought you knew about human history, consider subscribing to follow this investigation further. The evidence we're about to examine spans multiple tablets, ancient languages, astronomical cycles, cross-cultural parallels and geological records, drawing systematic connections between Mesopotamian mathematical precision, biblical chronology, Hindu cosmic timekeeping, Egyptian divine dynasty records, and the emerging geological evidence for catastrophic prehistoric events that align with the flood tradition with remarkable specificity. The prism itself measures 38.1 centimeters in height and approximately 9 centimeters on each of its 4 faces, a compact object that conceals within its inscribed surfaces one of the most controversial chronological documents ever recovered from ancient Mesopotamia. Herbert Weld-Blundell acquired the artifact in 1901, almost certainly through the active antiquities market that had developed around the excavation sites of southern Iraq, and donated it to the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford University, where it remains housed today under catalogue designation WB444. The prism is not unique. Scholars have identified at least 18 separate tablets and fragments containing versions of the Sumerian King List, including the Nippur Prism housed in the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, and numerous school tablet copies that indicate the document was part of standard scribal education across Mesopotamian civilization for well over a millennium. What makes the Weld-Blundell Prism significant is not its uniqueness, but its completeness. It preserves the most intact surviving version of a chronological record that every ancient Mesopotamian culture apparently treated not as mythology, but as actual history, a list of real rulers, real cities, and real reign durations extending back to a time that conventional archaeology insists did not contain advanced civilization of any kind. The document's physical characteristics alone communicate something about the seriousness with which the ancient scribes who produced it approached their task. The cuneiform impressions on the prism's four faces are executed with exceptional precision. The wedge-shaped marks of a trained hand working in the formal scribal tradition of the Isin-Lhasa period, approximately 1900 to 1800 before the Common Era, though the content the scribe was copying was already ancient when the prism was made. The text runs in vertical columns down each face, moving from right to left in the reading order characteristic of the period, and it begins with a declaration that is among the most cosmologically significant opening statements in any ancient document. The statement that before the Great Flood, kingship had descended from heaven, and that this heavenly kingship was exercised in specific cities by specific rulers for durations that the scribe recorded without apparent hesitation or qualification as historical fact. The cities named are real. Eridu exists as Tel Abu Shahrain in the Dikar Governorate of modern Iraq, and has been extensively excavated. Bad Tibira exists as Tel al-Madain, Sippar as Abu Haba, Shurupak as Tel Farah. These are not invented locations serving a narrative purpose. They are places with deep stratigraphic sequences and occupation histories that in several cases extend precisely as far back as the King List implies they should, a correspondence that the mythology hypothesis does not predict and cannot explain. When Leonard Woolley of the British Museum and the University of Pennsylvania Museum began excavating at Ur in 1922, and when Fuad Safar of the Iraqi Department of Antiquities opened systematic trenches at Eridu 2 decades later, what they found at the deepest levels was not the primitive beginning of a gradual developmental sequence. It was sophisticated material culture that appeared to have arrived rather than evolved. The scribal tradition that produced the Weld-Blundell Prism treated the King List as a living administrative document rather than a historical curiosity. Copies were made not only in monumental prism form but on flat tablets that served as practice texts for scribal students learning cuneiform, a fact that the British museologist Jeremy Black and his colleagues noted in their comprehensive survey of Old Babylonian scribal curricula published in 2004. This pedagogical function is significant. Ancient scribal schools did not waste student practice time on documents considered purely mythological. The categories of text used for scribal training included contracts, hymns, wisdom literature, and administrative formulae, all documents with practical application in the literate bureaucratic world of Mesopotamian civilization. The King List's inclusion in this category implies that its ancient transmitters considered it functionally useful, a framework for situating current rulers and institutions within a coherent historical continuum extending back to the beginning of human civilization as they understood it. The transmission history visible in the 18 known versions reveals something equally important. Variants appear at sites ranging from Nippur in central Mesopotamia to Lhasa in the south to Babylon in the north, spanning more than 1,000 years of continuous scribal tradition from approximately 2100 to 1000 before the Common Era. Across this geographical range and temporal span, the core numerical architecture of the antediluvian section remains intact. Individual names vary between versions, city assignments shift between traditions, but the mathematical structure of the reign durations, their relationship to a specific astronomical unit, and the fundamental division of history into pre-flood and post-flood periods remains absolutely consistent, precisely the pattern of variation expected from a document, preserving genuine historical memory across multiple independent transmission channels, rather than the pattern expected from documents invented for political or mythological purposes, which tend to show greater stability in names, while showing more flexibility in numbers. The implications of this transmission pattern become fully apparent only when the numbers themselves are subjected to the kind of mathematical analysis they clearly demand but have rarely received. The numbers assigned to the antediluvian kings in the Sumerian King List have generated more scholarly dismissal and less rigorous mathematical analysis than almost any other feature of ancient Mesopotamian literature, a situation that reveals more about the limitations of conventional chronological assumptions than it does about the document itself. Alulim of Eridu ruled for 28,800 years, Alalgar ruled for 36,000 years, Enmenluana governed for 43,200 years, Enmengalana reigned for 28,800 years, Dumuzi the shepherd held power for 36,000 years, Ensipad-Zid-Ana ruled for 28,800 years, Enmen-Durana governed for 21,000 years, Ubara-Tutu reigned for 18,600 years. Two additional rulers appear in the Berossus tradition and certain tablet variants, bringing the antediluvian total to 10, with their combined reigns summing to precisely 241,200 years. The scholarly reflex to label these figures as mythological exaggeration collapses entirely under mathematical scrutiny, because when these numbers are examined not as historical lifespans but as encoded astronomical periods, a pattern of extraordinary precision emerges that could not have been produced by random mythological invention under any reasonable probabilistic framework. The conventional academic dismissal of these figures typically proceeds through one of two arguments. Either the numbers are symbolic representations with no intended quantitative meaning, perhaps expressing qualities of greatness or cosmological significance through large numbers the way certain ancient cultures used numerical hyperbole in poetry and ritual texts, or they represent the total spans of entire dynasties or cultural periods collapsed under the name of a single representative figure. Both interpretations have been advanced by scholars of genuine distinction. Thorkild Jacobsen, whose 1939 analysis, the Sumerian King List, remains the foundational academic treatment of the document, inclined toward the dynastic interpretation. More recent scholars, including Piotr Michalowski of the University of Michigan, have emphasized the symbolic and ideological functions of the document within the political context of Isin period legitimation. These are serious scholars making serious arguments, and their work deserves acknowledgement. But neither interpretation confronts the fundamental mathematical problem that the numbers present when examined structurally rather than individually. Consider what random mythological number generation would be expected to produce. If ancient scribes were assigning large reign durations for symbolic or rhetorical purposes, with no underlying system constraining their choices, the resulting numbers should be irregular. Some should be round figures like 100,000 or 50,000. Others should be specific figures like 31,412 that appear precise without being mathematically structured. The distribution should show no systematic mathematical relationship between individual figures. What the Sumerian King List actually shows is the opposite of this expected pattern. Every single antediluvian reign duration across all 18 known versions is evenly divisible by a specific number that appears throughout Sumerian mathematical and astronomical texts as a unit of cosmic significance. The probability of 8 different large numbers all being exact multiples of the same value by chance, in a document supposedly composed through mythological imagination, can be calculated straightforwardly and approaches zero under any reasonable statistical framework. The individual numbers also exhibit internal relationships that reinforce their systematic character. The shortest antediluvian reign, assigned to Enmen-Dur-Ana at 21,000 years, and the longest, assigned to Enmen-Lu-Ana at 43,200 years, stand in a ratio of approximately 1 to 2.1. When the middle figures are examined, they cluster around multiples of 7,200 and 14,400 in patterns consistent with a framework built on specific astronomical periods rather than arbitrarily chosen large numbers. Enmen-Dur-Ana is particularly significant because this ruler appears in other Mesopotamian traditions as the founder of the diviner's art, the keeper of celestial secrets, and the human being who was taken up to heaven to learn the wisdom of the gods before returning to transmit it to humanity. His position in the King List and his distinctive numerical assignment suggest that the figures were chosen not for rhetorical effect, but to encode information about specific temporal relationships that the compilers of the list considered important enough to preserve with mathematical precision. The post-flood reigns underscore the systematic character of the antediluvian numbers through contrast. The first post-flood ruler, Etana of Kish, is credited with 1,560 years. His successor Bali received 400 years. The figures continue declining through subsequent dynasties toward historical periods where cross-reference with external sources becomes possible, and reign lengths approach normal human lifespans. This declining trajectory is not random. It follows a consistent mathematical pattern of reduction that suggests the compilers were tracking something measurable across both the antediluvian and post-diluvian periods, with the flood boundary marking not an arbitrary narrative division, but a quantitative threshold after which the units of measurement or the conditions being measured changed in a specific and systematic way. The nature of that specific unit becomes clear when the antediluvian figures are expressed in the mathematical language that the Sumerians themselves used for measuring cosmic time. The key to unlocking the antediluvian reign lengths lies in understanding a unit of time measurement that appears throughout Sumerian mathematical and astronomical texts, but rarely receives adequate attention in discussions of the King List itself. The Sumerians recognized a unit they called the SAR, derived from the same root as their word for the cosmos or totality, which represented a cycle of 3,600 years. This number was not arbitrary. 3,600 is the square of 60, and 60 was the foundational base of all Sumerian mathematics, a system that modern civilization still uses whenever we divide an hour into 60 minutes, or a circle into 360 degrees. When the antediluvian reign lengths are expressed not in individual years but as multiples of the SAR, every single figure on the King List resolves to a whole number without remainder. Alulim's 28,800 years equals precisely 8 SAR. Alalgar's 36,000 years equals exactly 10 SAR. Enmenluana's 43,200 years equals 12 SAR. The pattern is not coincidence. It demonstrates that the compilers of the Sumerian King List were not recording individual human lifespans in conventional years, but were instead encoding periods of time measured in a cosmic unit tied directly to the mathematical structure of the universe as the ancient Mesopotamians understood it, and as modern astronomical science has confirmed it to be. The SAR appears throughout the cuneiform record in contexts that establish its status as far more than a bookkeeping convenience. In Sumerian administrative texts, the SAR represents the largest standard unit in the system of nested multiples that organize Sumerian counting. 1 SAR equals 60 Enna, 1 Ner equals 60 SOSS, 1 SOS equals 10. The system mirrors the nested structure of the sexagesimal number system itself, creating a hierarchy of units in which each level represents a specific power of 60. But the SAR's significance extends beyond administrative mathematics into cosmological and astronomical contexts, where it appears as a measurement of time cycles rather than quantities of objects or parcels of land. Astronomical tablets from the Old Babylonian period, approximately 1800 before the Common Era, and from the Neo-Babylonian Astronomical Archive compiled between 600 and 300 before the Common Era at Babylon, employ the SAR unit in calculations of planetary cycles, eclipse cycles, and what the texts describe as the great years of cosmic renewal, longer cycles built from multiples of the SAR that track astronomical phenomena operating on timescales far exceeding individual human observation. The relationship between the SR and known astronomical periods is not coincidental, but structurally embedded in the mathematics of celestial mechanics. 3,600 years is approximately 166 full cycles of the Metonic period of 19 years, which synchronizes the solar and lunar calendars with extraordinary precision and was recognized independently by Babylonian, Greek and Chinese astronomers as one of the fundamental organizing cycles of observational astronomy. 3,600 years also represents approximately 2 units of the Hipparchian precession calculation, an estimate that was off by a factor of roughly 6 from the true precessional period, but that reflects the same mathematical framework the Sumerians were using when they constructed the SAR as a unit of cosmic time. When the full precessional cycle of 25,920 years is expressed in SR units, it resolves to 7.2 SAR, a figure that generates the astronomical number 7,200 when the decimal is cleared, and 7,200 is itself a number that appears throughout Sumerian astronomical calculations as a fundamental period in eclipse and planetary cycle prediction. The cuneiform mathematical tablets held in the British Museum, including the collection catalogued in Reginald Campbell Thompson's 1900 report, and the later systematic analyses published by Otto Neugebauer in his landmark 1955 work, The Exact Sciences in Antiquity, demonstrate that Babylonian mathematicians were solving problems whose complexity required not only the SAR unit, but also understanding of long-period cycles built from SR multiples. Neugebauer's careful analysis of the astronomical tablets showed that Babylonian astronomers used what modern mathematics recognizes as arithmetic progressions and second-order difference sequences to model planetary motions, with accuracy approaching that of early modern European astronomy, all within a mathematical framework built on the sexagesimal base and the SAR as its fundamental large unit. What Neugebauer's landmark work did not fully explore, and what subsequent researchers, including the mathematician and historian of science John Steele, of Brown University have begun to examine more carefully is the possibility that this mathematical framework preserves not just Babylonian computational technique, but a much older cosmological architecture in which the SAR represented a genuine unit of historical time tied to astronomical cycles of real physical significance. The implications for reading the King List are substantial. If the compilers were using SAR units to record historical periods rather than individual lifespans, then what the antediluvian section actually preserves is a sequence of cosmic ages, each spanning several SR cycles, within which specific divine or semi-divine governance prevailed over the civilization of the antediluvian world. This reading aligns the Sumerian tradition with the great year concepts of Greek philosophical astronomy, the yuga cycles of Hindu cosmological time, and the world-age traditions of multiple other ancient cultures, all of which divide cosmic history into nested cycles of declining duration measured in astronomical units, all of which preserve the same base numbers that appear in the Sumerian antediluvian framework, and none of which can be explained as borrowing from Mesopotamian sources, because the mathematical relationships they share predate any documented cultural contact between these civilizations. This convergence across independent traditions points toward a single conclusion. The SAR was not invented by Sumerian scribes. It was inherited by them from a mathematical and astronomical tradition of far greater antiquity. One of the most immediately striking features of the antediluvian king tradition is that it does not exist in a single standardized form, and scholars who have used the discrepancy in numbers between different versions as grounds for dismissing the list as unreliable mythology have fundamentally misunderstood what the variation actually demonstrates about the document's transmission history. The Weld-Blundell Prism and several related Sumerian tablets list 8 kings who ruled before the flood. The Babylonian priest Berossus, writing in the 3rd century before the Common Era and drawing upon direct access to the cuneiform library archives of Babylon, recorded 10 antediluvian rulers in his chronicle titled Babyloniaca, a work preserved in fragments through later Greek and Armenian sources, including Alexander Polyhistor and Eusebius of Caesarea. A 3rd version, recovered in fragmentary form from tablets excavated at Larsa and dated to approximately 1900 before the Common Era, lists 8 kings, but assigns them to different cities than the Weld-Blundell version. Rather than invalidating the tradition, these variations reveal something more significant. Multiple independent transmission channels were preserving the same fundamental chronological framework through different scribal schools, different cities, and different historical periods, all maintaining the core mathematical structure of SR-based reign durations, while varying in peripheral details of names and locations in exactly the manner expected from a genuine historical tradition preserved through oral transmission before it was committed to clay. The difference between 8 and 10 antediluvian rulers has occupied considerable scholarly attention, and the debate has been conducted primarily as a problem of textual criticism, asking which version reflects an earlier or more authoritative source. But this framing misses the more significant insight that the difference between the versions offers. When Berossus records 10 antediluvian kings rather than 8, he is not correcting the Sumerian tradition. He's preserving a parallel tradition from a different stream of transmission within the same institutional framework, specifically the priestly library tradition of the Asagila temple in Babylon, which maintained astronomical and historical records independently of the scribal school traditions that produced the Weld-Blundell and Nippur prisms. The Asagila library, whose existence and contents are attested in multiple Neo-Babylonian administrative records, was not a public institution. It was an archive of priestly knowledge maintained by hereditary temple scholars whose access to ancient documents was more direct and less filtered through the standardization processes of the scribal school curriculum. Berossus, as a priest of Marduk with direct access to this archive, may have been drawing on source materials older and less editorially processed than those available to the scribal schools that produced the prism tradition. The mathematical structure shared between the two versions provides the crucial evidence that both are drawing on the same underlying framework despite their surface differences. Berossus's 10 kings are assigned reigns in SAR units, just as the 8 kings of the Sumerian prism tradition are, and the total of his list, 120 SAR or 432,000 years, stands in a precise mathematical relationship to the total of the Sumerian prism tradition that reveals they are expressing the same cosmological framework through different editorial choices about which rulers to include. 432,000 divided by 241,200 yields a ratio of approximately 1.79, which is not immediately illuminating, but when both totals are expressed in SAR units, they resolve to 120 and 67 SAR respectively, and the difference of 53 SAR between them corresponds to precisely the number of SAR cycles required to bring the shorter total to the nearest astronomically significant multiple of 60. The two traditions are not contradicting each other. They're encoding the same cosmic chronological framework from different editorial starting points within a shared mathematical system. The geographical distribution of the known versions provides additional evidence for the interpretation of the King List as a transmission of genuine historical tradition rather than political myth-making. Prism copies appear at Nippur, which was Mesopotamia's primary scribal and religious centre, throughout the 3rd and 2nd millennia before the Common Era. Tablet copies appear at Larsa, Babylon, Kish, and Ur, cities whose independent scribal traditions were sometimes in political competition with each other, but maintained consistent scribal curricula that preserved the King List across political boundaries. If the document had been invented primarily as a legitimating device for a specific dynasty or city, it would have been expected to show greater variation between versions produced at rival centres, each adapting the content to favour their own institutional history. Instead, the variations are peripheral, and the mathematical core is universally preserved. A distribution pattern that indicates all versions derive from a common source, predating the political divisions that characterized Mesopotamian civilization during the period of the list's known transmission. The Larsa version's reassignment of cities to different rulers is particularly instructive in this regard. Where the Weld-Blundell Prism places Dumuzi at Bad Tibira, the Larsa version places him at a different location. Where the Prism tradition locates certain kings at Sippar, the Larsa variant records different city assignments. These variations suggest that different scribal schools preserve different aspects of a tradition whose details had become uncertain through transmission, but whose mathematical backbone remained intact because it was the most precisely defined and therefore the most easily verified component of the record across all versions. A tradition whose peripheral details vary, while its mathematical core remains invariant, is precisely what a genuine historical memory transmitted over many generations before being committed to writing should be expected to look like, not what a document invented for political purposes should look like. The evidence from the multiple versions converges on a model in which the Sumerian King List was not composed at any single moment by any single author for any single political purpose, but accumulated through a long process of transmission from sources that predated the earliest known writing, organized around a mathematical framework of astronomical significance that served as an anchor preserving the chronological structure even as peripheral details varied across different streams of transmission. Understanding this transmission history is essential for evaluating the archaeological evidence from the 5 cities the King List identifies as the centers of antediluvian civilization. The Sumerian King List names 5 specific cities as the locations where antediluvian kingship was exercised before the flood swept over the earth: Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, and Shurupak. These are not mythological places invented for narrative convenience. Archaeological excavations have located and extensively investigated all 5 sites, and the physical evidence recovered from their deepest occupation strata presents a consistent pattern that conventional archaeology struggles to accommodate within its standard developmental framework. Each of these cities shows occupation extending to levels that predate the earliest known writing by well over a millennium, with the material culture at the lowest levels displaying a sophistication that appears to have emerged without the gradual developmental stages archaeologists expect to find when tracing the origins of complex civilization. At Eridu, excavations conducted by the Iraqi Department of Antiquities under Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd between 1946 and 1949 uncovered 17 distinct building levels within the temple precinct alone, the deepest dating to approximately 5,500 before the Common Era, each level showing not gradual improvement but consistent architectural knowledge that challenges linear models of technological development in the ancient Near East. At Shurupak, modern Tel Fair in southern Iraq, excavations led by Robert Koldewey for the German Oriental Society and followed by University of Pennsylvania expeditions in the 1920s uncovered occupation layers extending to the 5th millennium before the Common Era, with the lowest levels containing ceramic traditions and architectural knowledge that display no clear developmental antecedents in the surrounding archaeological record. Sippar, identified with modern Abu Haba and excavated extensively by Hormuzd Rassam for the British Museum, beginning in 1881 and continued by subsequent Iraqi expeditions through the 20th century, presents a stratigraphic sequence of comparable depth. The lowest occupation levels at Sippar reached in the deep soundings conducted by the Belgian expedition of the 1970s and 80s date to the early Ubaid period, approximately 5500 before the Common Era, and show the same pattern of apparent technological competence without clear developmental precursors that characterizes the earliest levels at Eridu and Shurupak. The temple complex at Sippar, dedicated to Shamash, the sun god, occupies a position in the city that the King List associates with antediluvian royal activity, and the deep structural investigations conducted beneath it revealed building sequences whose earliest phases incorporated sophisticated orientation and proportional knowledge inconsistent with the assumption that the site's original builders were working through primitive trial and error. Larak, long the most uncertain of the 5 antediluvian cities, has been tentatively identified with Tel Wilaya in the Wasit Governorate of modern Iraq by scholars, including Eckhard Unger, working in the 1930s, and more recently by researchers associated with the British Museum's Mesopotamia survey programs. Surface surveys and limited sounding excavations at Tel Wilaya have produced Ubaid period ceramics from the deepest accessible levels, consistent with the occupation depths found at the other antediluvian sites, though the site's full stratigraphic sequence remains inadequately investigated due to modern land use and the difficulties of archaeological fieldwork in southern Iraq during recent decades. Bad Tibira, identified with Tel al-Madain in Dikar province, has yielded similar evidence in the form of deep Ubaid period occupation horizons, whose ceramic traditions show continuity with those found at Eridu and other southern Mesopotamian sites of the same period, indicating that the 5 cities named in the King List were not geographically isolated, but formed part of an interconnected cultural network whose early phases extended back thousands of years before the conventional beginning of Mesopotamian urban civilization. The consistency of the evidence from all 5 sites reveals a pattern that the conventional developmental model was not designed to accommodate. Standard archaeological models of the origins of urban civilization in Mesopotamia, based on the influential work of Gordon Childe in the 1930s and refined by Robert Adams through his settlement pattern surveys of the 1960s and 70s, predict that complex cities should emerge gradually from simpler settlements, with each developmental stage showing clear evidence of accumulated learning, failed experiments, and incremental improvement. What the 5 antediluvian cities show instead, at their deepest accessible levels, is the sudden appearance of architectural and technical competence without the expected preparatory stages. At Eridu in particular, where the 17-level temple sequence provides the most complete picture of early Mesopotamian religious architecture yet recovered from any single site, the transition from the surrounding prehistoric landscape to the earliest temple structures involves a qualitative jump in organizational complexity and technical knowledge that remains unexplained by any currently accepted model of cultural evolution in the ancient Near East. The cities before the flood were real places. What happened in them before the flood is the question that the archaeological evidence forces upon us with increasing urgency. The Sumerians themselves were explicit about which city came first. Their texts consistently identify Eridu, located in the southern marshlands of what is now southern Iraq near the modern city of Nasiriyah, as the first city ever established, the place where kingship descended from heaven at the beginning of human civilization, and the primary seat of the deity Enki, the Sumerian god of wisdom, water, and the foundational knowledge that enabled urban life. This ancient claim seemed like religious mythology to early archaeologists. Excavations beginning in the 1940s changed that assessment entirely. The 17 building levels uncovered beneath the Eridu temple mount span approximately 3,000 years of continuous occupation, beginning around 5,500 before the Common Era, and representing the longest unbroken sequence of temple construction yet identified at any single site in Mesopotamia. The earliest temple structures at the bottom of this sequence, designated by excavators as temples 16 and 17, are small rectangular shrines measuring approximately 3 meters by 4 meters, but they already display the characteristic features of later Mesopotamian sacred architecture. Raised platforms, offering tables bearing evidence of burnt materials, and niched exterior walls whose decorative and possibly functional significance persisted in Mesopotamian religious construction for 3,000 subsequent years. The cultural assemblage associated with these earliest levels, known to archaeologists as the Ubaid tradition, appears at Eridu before it appears anywhere else in the archaeological record, a distributional fact that lends unexpected empirical weight to the ancient claim that this specific location was the origin point of the civilizational tradition the King List is documenting. Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd, working under the authority of the Iraqi Department of Antiquities, began systematic excavation at Eridu in 1946 and continued through 1949, producing stratigraphic results that remain the primary reference point for understanding the site's deep history. Their published report, issued by the Iraqi government in 1981 under the title Eridu, documents the 17 temple levels in detail sufficient to allow assessment of what each level's material culture actually represents in terms of technical capability and organizational complexity. What Safar and Lloyd found at the deepest levels was not a tentative beginning. Temples 16 and 17, the oldest structures in the sequence, already demonstrate understanding of the cardinal orientation principles, tripartite room divisions, and recessed niche decorations that would characterize Mesopotamian sacred architecture the next 3,000 years without significant modification. A tradition does not begin with its mature form unless it was either carried to its location from somewhere else that had already developed it, or unless the developmental stages occurred at a time and place not yet accessible to the archaeological record. At Eridu, neither possibility is more comfortable than the other. The fish bones that Safar and Lloyd recovered from the offering deposits associated with the earliest temple levels provide an additional layer of significance. The species represented, predominantly freshwater and estuarine fish from the marshes and waterways surrounding the ancient site, were not simply the remains of meals. They were offerings to Enki, whose domain in Sumerian cosmology encompassed not only wisdom and the civilizational arts, but also water in all its forms, the fresh groundwater of the Abzu, the rivers and marshes of the physical landscape, and the cosmic waters of the primordial deep from which all creation emerged. The continuity of this fish-offering tradition from the very earliest temple levels through the subsequent 3,000 years of Eridu's occupation indicates that the theological framework within which the city operated was not gradually constructed during the Ubaid period, but was in place at the site's foundation. A fully realized religious and cosmological system expressing itself in standardized ritual behavior from the moment the first small shrine was built above the southern marshes. The geographical setting of Eridu is itself cosmologically significant in ways that the Sumerian texts make explicit and that archaeological investigation has confirmed. This site sits at the edge of the ancient marshland zone, at a point where fresh groundwater meets the salt water of the Persian Gulf's ancient shoreline, a liminal boundary that the Sumerians identified as the physical location of the Abzu, the freshwater underground ocean that Enki governed, and from which the creative wisdom enabling civilization flowed. The choice of this specific location for the world's first city, if the Sumerian claim is taken seriously, reflects sophisticated understanding of the symbolic and possibly practical significance of freshwater emergence at coastal margins, an understanding that the Ubaid communities responsible for Eridu's earliest occupation expressed in their architectural and ritual choices with a consistency suggesting it was received knowledge rather than locally developed theology. The ceramic sequence from Eridu's earliest levels, designated by archaeologists as Ubaid 0 through Ubaid 1, displays technical characteristics that complicate any straightforward narrative of gradual ceramic development in southern Mesopotamia. The pottery from the deepest Eridu levels, analysed in detail by Joan Oates in her 1960 study published in the journal Iraq, shows controlled firing temperatures, standardized vessel forms, and decorative conventions that imply a tradition of established practice rather than experimental innovation. The geometric painted designs on these earlier ceramics include patterns involving concentric circles, hatched triangles, and flowing vegetal motifs whose mathematical regularity and technical execution quality exceed what experimental pottery production in a newly established settlement would typically produce. Oates and subsequent researchers, including Robert Henriksen in the 1980s, noted the absence of cruder precursor forms in the Eridu sequence, a gap in the developmental record that conventional models attribute to incomplete preservation, but that might equally reflect incomplete assumptions about where that development occurred before it appeared at Eridu fully formed. By the time Eridu's temple sequence reaches its middle levels, the architectural scale and organizational complexity of the structures has increased dramatically but continuously, with each successive level building on the same foundational principles already established in the earliest shrines. Temple 7, dating to approximately 4500 before the Common Era, covers an area of approximately 12 meters by 8 meters and incorporates buttressed exterior walls, an elaborated central sanctuary, and a complex of subsidiary rooms that indicate a differentiated religious staff performing multiple specialized functions within a single institution. This organizational complexity, appearing within the same unbroken architectural sequence that began with the 3 by 4 meter shrines of Temples 16 and 17, suggests that the foundational knowledge encoded in those earlier structures contained within it the organizational logic that eventually expressed itself in the massive temple complexes of the later Sumerian period. The seed and the mature plant were organized according to the same principles from the beginning. The city whose origins at Eridu preceded writing, and whose antediluvian reign record the King List preserves in SAR-based astronomical units, was not alone in attracting the attention of scholars attempting to understand how its traditions were transmitted to later civilizations. The most significant vector of transmission for the antediluvian chronological framework from Mesopotamian cuneiform sources to the broader ancient world was not archaeological rediscovery in the modern era, but active intellectual transmission during the Hellenistic period, when a Babylonian priest of exceptional erudition undertook a systematic effort to make the accumulated knowledge of the Asagular Temple archive available to Greek readers. When Alexander the Great conquered Babylon in 331 before the Common Era, he encountered a civilization that claimed access to astronomical observation records spanning hundreds of thousands of years, a claim that Greek scholars found simultaneously incredible and impossible to dismiss, given the precision of Babylonian planetary predictions. Among the Babylonian intellectuals who attempted to translate this ancient knowledge for Greek audiences was a priest of Marduk named Berossus, who composed a 3-volume historical and cosmological work drawing directly on the cuneiform archives of the Asagular Temple complex in Babylon around 280 before the Common Era. The work survives only in fragments preserved through later writers, but these fragments preserve something of extraordinary significance for the antediluvian king tradition, a version of the pre-flood ruler list that differs from Sumerian sources in certain names and cities, while maintaining the identical mathematical structure of SAR-based reign durations that makes the Sumerian list so mathematically remarkable. Berossus recorded 10 kings who ruled before the flood, assigning their reigns in units that his Greek intermediaries translated as SARs, each representing 3,600 years. His first king, called Alurus, ruled for 10 such units, equating to 36,000 years. His 10th and final pre-flood king, Xisuthros, is identified by scholars as corresponding to the flood hero Ziusudra known from Sumerian sources. The combined total of Berossus's 10 kings reaches 120 SAR, or 432,000 years, a number whose significance extends far beyond Babylonian tradition into the mathematical frameworks of cultures that had no documented contact with Mesopotamia, and whose recurrence across independent civilizational traditions demands a systematic explanation that the mythology hypothesis cannot provide. The survival of Berossus's Babyloniaca through intermediary sources rather than direct manuscript transmission is itself a significant feature of the document's history. The original 3-volume work, almost certainly composed in Greek for the benefit of this Macedonian court that had assumed control of Babylon following Alexander's death, was available to scholars of the ancient world for several centuries before disappearing from the historical record. Its contents are preserved primarily through the summaries and excerpts provided by Alexander Polyhistor, a 1st century before the Common Era writer who quoted Berossus extensively in his own geographical and historical works, and by Eusebius of Caesarea, the 4th century bishop whose Praeparatio Evangelica and Chronicon preserved substantial portions of Polyhistor's summaries. A 3rd transmission pathway comes through Josephus Flavius, the 1st century Jewish historian whose Antiquities of the Jews quoted Berossus on the flood tradition, and whose Against Apian cited him on matters of historical chronology. The convergence of these 3 independent transmission chains, each preserving consistent versions of the antediluvian reign lengths and the SR unit framework, demonstrates that the mathematical structure of Berossus's account was not introduced by later copyists, but was an original feature of the Babyloniaca accurately preserved across multiple channels. The specific figures Berossus assigns to his 10 antediluvian kings reveal a mathematical architecture that differs from the Sumerian 8-king tradition in instructive ways. Alorus receives 10 SAR, equaling 36,000 years. Alaparos receives 3 SAR. Amalon receives 13 SAR. Ammonon receives 12 SAR. Amygalaris receives 18 SAR. Daus receives 10 SAR. Euedorakis receives 18 SAR. Amempsinos receives 10 SAR. Otiates receives 8 SAR. Xisuthrus receives 18 SAR. The distribution of these values across 10 rulers produces a total of 120 SAR that is mathematically distinct from the Sumerian total of 67 SAR, while being simultaneously and precisely equal to the product of the 2 most astronomically significant numbers in the Babylonian mathematical system: 12, the number of zodiacal constellations and months in the calendar year, multiplied by 10, the foundational decimal unit. This cannot be accidental. It encodes within the total duration of the antediluvian period the same relationship between the 12-fold division of the zodiac and the decimal system that underlies Babylonian mathematical astronomy, expressing cosmological knowledge about the structure of time itself within what appears on the surface to be a simple list of royal reign lengths. Berossus's identification of the last antediluvian king as Xisuthrus, the flood hero, provides an explicit connection between the chronological framework of the King List and the flood narrative traditions that appear in the Atrahasis epic, the Epic of Gilgamesh, and the fragmentary Sumerian flood story tablet from Nippur, analysed by Arno Peubel in his 1914 publication Historical and Grammatical Texts. The figure of Xisuthrus, described by Berossus as having received advance warning of the flood from the god Kronos, the Greek equivalent of Enki in this context, and as having built a vessel that preserved human, animal and written knowledge through the catastrophe, performs the same structural role in the Babylonian tradition that Utnapishtim performs in the Gilgamesh version and Ziusudra performs in the Sumerian version. The consistency of this figure across all 3 transmission channels indicates not the mutual borrowing of a single legend, but the independent preservation of a single tradition about a single historical figure, one who occupied a specific position in an actual chronological sequence and whose identification as the last pre-flood ruler connects the antediluvian rain framework to the physical catastrophe that the geological record increasingly confirms was real. What happened at the boundary that Berhosse's Xisuthros and the Sumerian King List both mark with such mathematical precision is legible in the structure of the post-flood King List, whose numbers tell a story of civilizational disruption more clearly than any ancient text that frames that story in explicit narrative terms. The most immediate objection to treating the antediluvian rain, lengths as anything other than mythology, is the sharp discontinuity they display at the flood boundary, a discontinuity that, on closer examination, actually constitutes one of the most compelling pieces of evidence that the King List is encoding real, chronological information rather than inventing fictional periods. After the flood swept over the earth and kingship descended from heaven a second time, the list records that the seat of kingship was established at Kish, and the reigns assigned to Kish's earliest post-flood rulers, while still extraordinary by modern standards, are dramatically shorter than their antediluvian predecessors. Etana of Kish is credited with 1,560 years. Bali ruled for 400 years. Enmenuna governed for 660 years. These figures still far exceed normal human lifespans, but they represent a reduction of roughly 90% from the antediluvian reigns, and they continue declining through subsequent dynasties in a pattern that accelerates toward historical periods where the reigns can be cross-checked against external sources and found to approach accuracy. Enmebahagisi of Kish, whose name appears on actual archaeological artifacts excavated at the site by the Oriental Institute of Chicago, is assigned a reign of 900 years, while his successor Acre receives only 600 years. By the time the list reaches rulers verifiable against other ancient records, the figures have contracted to lengths consistent with normal human lifespans. This trajectory is not random. It follows a consistent pattern of exponential decline that suggests the King List is tracking something measurable and real, rather than arbitrarily assigning decreasing mythological numbers to fill narrative space before historically documented rulers. The mechanics of this decline deserve closer examination than they typically receive. When the post-flood reign lengths from the first dynasty of Kish through the first dynasty of Uruk are plotted as a sequence, they produce a curve whose mathematical character is not linear but exponential, declining steeply at first and then more gradually as the figure approached the range of historically plausible individual human lifespans. The reign of Etana at 1,560 years represents a dramatic initial step down from the shortest antediluvian reign of 18,600 years assigned to Ubaratutu, but subsequent Kish kings show continued decline. Bali at 400 years, Enmenuna at 660 years, Melamkish at 900 years, Barselnuna at 1,200 years, Samug at 140 years, Tizkar at 305 years, Ilku at 900 years, Iltaserim at 1,200 years, and Enmebarajesi at 900 years. The sequence is not perfectly monotonically decreasing. Individual reigns vary, and some later kings are assigned longer reigns than some earlier ones. But the overall trajectory across the full first dynasty of Kish shows unmistakable convergence toward historically realistic values, a convergence whose mathematical character suggests the compilers were not inventing numbers, but recording a genuine quantity that was decreasing over time, according to some process they could observe and measure. The figure of Enmebarajesi provides the critical empirical anchor for the entire post-flood section of the King List. His name, meaning the one who made the hair of the enemy unkempt in submission, appears in the standard transliteration on two alabaster vessel fragments excavated at Nippur by the Oriental Institute expeditions of the 1930s, and studied in detail by Thorkild Jakobsen, who published his analysis in the Journal of Near Eastern Studies in 1957. These fragments bear the name Enmebaragisi, alongside royal titles in a script that paleographers date to approximately 2600 before the Common Era, making them among the earliest epigraphic attestations of any named individual in all of human history. The King List assigns this historically confirmed ruler a reign of 900 years, a figure still far beyond normal human lifespan, but one that occurs within the declining trajectory of a sequence converging toward historical reality from the much larger numbers of earlier entries. This combination of confirmed historicity and still extraordinary reign duration suggests that what the King List is tracking through its post-flood figures is not individual human lifespans in the modern biological sense, but something else that was real, measurable, and declining across the generations following the catastrophic event that the tradition marks at its chronological centre. The post-flood section structure also reveals an important feature that distinguishes the King List from simple legitimating mythology: the explicit recording of interdynastic transitions and defeats. The list does not claim continuous success for any single ruling line. It records that kingship passed from Kish to Uruk following a military conflict, that it was subsequently taken by Ewan, and that further transfers occurred across multiple cities, in a sequence that includes documentation of political disruptions the compilers had no motivation to invent if their purpose was purely to legitimize current rulers by projecting their authority into an imaginary past. A mythological document designed for legitimating purposes would be expected to show continuous, uninterrupted descent from the antediluvian period through the current dynasty. The King List instead shows repeated discontinuities, contested transitions, and the elevation of cities whose later political importance was not always dominant. A pattern of historical fidelity that argues against the mythology hypothesis and for genuine historical transmission. The convergence of the post-flood figures toward historically verifiable values, combined with the structural honesty of the dynastic transfer record, provides strong grounds for taking the entire document seriously as a chronological framework encoding real information, including the antediluvian section whose numbers exceed biological possibility, but whose mathematical structure encodes astronomical precision. The tradition being preserved did not begin with Mesopotamian scribes working in the 3rd millennium before the Common Era. Its parallels in the Hebrew textual tradition demonstrate that the underlying chronological framework was widespread across ancient Near Eastern cultures, and that its appearance in Genesis represents independent preservation of the same astronomical encoding system through a different cultural vocabulary. The 5th chapter of Genesis presents a chronological puzzle that biblical scholars have debated for centuries but rarely examined in direct comparative analysis with its Mesopotamian counterpart, a comparison that reveals the two traditions are documenting the same underlying phenomenon through different cultural vocabularies. The antediluvian patriarchs listed in Genesis, the 10 generations from Adam to Noah, are assigned lifespans that are impossible by modern biological standards, but systematically shorter than those of the Sumerian antediluvian kings, creating a parallel structure too consistent across two independent traditions to be dismissed as coincidence. Adam lived 930 years, Seth 912, Enosh 805, Kenan 910, Mahalalel 895, Jared 962, Enoch 365, a number whose astronomical significance will become apparent when precessional cycles are examined more carefully. Methuselah 969, the longest lifespan in the biblical record. Lamech 777, Noah 950. As with the Sumerian list, the lifespans drop sharply after the flood, with Abraham living only 175 years and subsequent patriarchs declining further toward normal human ranges within a few generations. The two lists, Sumerian and biblical, share the identical structural architecture. 10 or 8 antediluvian figures with extraordinary longevity expressed in mathematical units, a world-destroying flood at the boundary between ages, and a post-diluvian period of dramatically reduced and systematically declining lifespans, all converging on the hypothesis that both traditions independently preserved memory of an actual historical disruption that fundamentally altered the conditions of human life on Earth. The textual history of Genesis chapter 5 positions its antediluvian genealogy within a documentary tradition designated by biblical scholars using the source critical notation P for the priestly source, which represents a strand of the Pentateuch compiled during or after the Babylonian exile period of the 6th century before the Common Era. The priestly writers were working in Babylonia with direct exposure to cuneiform literary traditions including the King List and the Atrahasis epic, and scholars of the caliber of E.A. Spicer, whose landmark Anchor Bible commentary on Genesis was published in 1964, have long acknowledged that the P genealogy of Genesis 5 shows structural parallels with the Mesopotamian antediluvian tradition. However, the standard critical position treats this parallel as a case of Israelite scribes borrowing and adapting Babylonian literary conventions, rather than as evidence that both traditions independently preserve a common and genuinely ancient chronological framework. This interpretation encounters a difficulty that parallel structure analysis makes apparent. If the biblical genealogy were simply an adaptation of the Babylonian King List, it should reflect the mathematical architecture of its source, meaning SAR-based values, or multiples of 3,600. Instead, the Genesis figures operate according to an entirely different numerical system, one based on multiples of 60 and 160, with values clustering around 900 in a distribution that cannot be derived from the King List numbers through any simple transformation, suggesting the two traditions were not related by direct borrowing, but by common origin in a shared antediluvian chronological framework that each cultural tradition encoded in its own mathematical vocabulary. The figure of Enoch demands particular attention in this comparative analysis. Assigned a lifespan of 365 years, the only antediluvian patriarch whose lifespan corresponds to a well-known astronomical period, Enoch occupies the 7th position in the genealogical sequence, a position that in Mesopotamian tradition corresponds to Enmeduranki, the 7th antediluvian king of the Sumerian list, and the figure most closely associated with astronomical and divinatory knowledge. The correlation of position, astronomical significance of the lifespan number, and the tradition preserved in the extra-canonical Book of Enoch that this patriarch was taken up to heaven to receive cosmic knowledge and return to transmit it to humanity, aligns precisely with what Mesopotamian sources say about Enmeduranki's relationship with the divine assembly and his role as the founder of the divinatory arts. The probability that these parallels in position, astronomical number, and celestial knowledge narrative all resulted from independent development, rather than from common inheritance of a shared tradition, approaches zero under systematic probabilistic analysis. The post-flood collapse of lifespans in Genesis mirrors the pattern found in the King List, with a mathematical precision that independently supports the astronomical encoding interpretation. Abraham's lifespan of 175 years represents a decline of approximately 80% from the pre-flood values, a proportional reduction consistent with the 90% decline observed in the King List at the same chronological boundary. The subsequent patriarchs of Genesis continue declining toward historical norms. Isaac at 180 years, Jacob at 147, Joseph at 110, Moses at 120, and Joshua at 110, before the text's chronological figures converge entirely on normal human biological ranges. Both lists, in both traditions, are telling the same story in the same mathematical language. Something changed at the flood boundary, something that affected the fundamental parameters within which the figures the list record were being calculated, and it changed in a way that was real enough to be expressed with quantitative precision across independent cultural transmissions separated by geography, language, and theological framework. The number that unites these independent traditions with the greatest analytical force is not the individual values assigned to antediluvian rulers or patriarchs, but the total duration that the Babylonian tradition assigns to the pre-flood period as a whole, a number whose appearance in cultures genuinely independent of Mesopotamian influence constitutes perhaps the single most compelling piece of evidence for the existence of a shared antediluvian astronomical knowledge system. When Berossus calculated the total duration of antediluvian kingship in his version of the pre-flood record, he arrived at 432,000 years, the product of his 10 kings SAR-based reigns summed in Babylonian mathematical notation. This number should have been an obscure curiosity confined to one tradition of one ancient civilization. Instead, it appears across multiple cultures that had no documented contact with Mesopotamia, encoded in cosmological frameworks of extraordinary mathematical sophistication, a distribution so consistent and so precise that it demands explanation beyond the reach of coincidence theory. In Hindu cosmological tradition, the Kali Yuga, the final and darkest of the 4 cosmic ages currently being experienced by humanity, is assigned a duration of exactly 432,000 years. The full cycle of 4 cosmic ages, the Mahayuga, totals 4,320,000 years, precisely 10 times the Kali Yuga figure and the Berossus total. The Satya Yuga lasts 1,728,000 years, which is 4 times 432,000. The Treta Yuga spans 1,296,000 years, 3 times the base number. Every figure in the Hindu cosmic chronology is a multiple of 432,000, the same base number that emerges from the Sumerian antediluvian King List. In Norse mythology, as recorded in the prose Edda compiled by Snorri Sturluson in the 13th century of the Common Era, but drawing on much older oral traditions, the warriors inhabiting Valhalla number exactly 432,000, organized into 1,200 halls each containing 360 warriors, a number that encodes the same mathematical relationship between the SAR cycle and astronomical periods found independently in Mesopotamian sources. The probability that 3 geographically separated and culturally distinct civilizations converged on this precise base number through independent mythological invention approaches mathematical impossibility. The Hindu cosmological system that employs the 432,000-year base unit is not a late development within Indian religious thought. The Vishnu Purana, which provides the most detailed account of the Yuga system and its mathematical architecture, draws on cosmological frameworks embedded in the Vedic tradition, whose core texts are among the oldest continuously transmitted literary documents in human history. with linguistic analysis placing the earliest Rigvedic hymns at approximately 1500 to 1200 before the Common Era or earlier. The Yuga chronology itself appears in the Mahabharata, whose core narrative traditions scholars of the caliber of Alf Hilterbytel of George Washington University have traced to a period preceding its compilation into the Sanskrit epic form recognizable today. The mathematical structure of the Yuga system, with its 4 ages standing in the ratio 4 to 3 to 2 to 1, and all expressed as multiples of the base period, demonstrates astronomical knowledge and cosmological architecture that was not constructed to serve any immediate narrative or ritual purpose, but encodes a framework for understanding cosmic time, whose mathematical properties are identical to those encoded in the Mesopotamian antediluvian King List through an entirely independent cultural tradition. The Norse parallel deserves more detailed examination than it typically receives in comparative mythological literature. Snorri Sturluson's prose, Edda, compiled in Iceland around 1220 of the Common Era, is acknowledged by all scholars of Old Norse literature as a synthesis of earlier oral traditions whose antiquity cannot be precisely determined, but whose content displays features consistent with pre-Christian Norse religious thought, predating the Christianization of Scandinavia in the 10th and 11th centuries. The specific passage in the Grimnismal, one of the poems of the poetic Edda, whose text the prose Edda preserves and comments upon, that assigns 800 warriors to each of Valhalla's 540 doors, with the total product yielding 432,000, is not a rhetorically motivated choice of large impressive numbers. It is a precisely constructed mathematical statement that encodes the same base number found in the Babylonian and Hindu traditions within a mythological narrative that has no obvious motivation for using this specific figure rather than any other large number. The Norse tradition had no documented contact with either Mesopotamian or Indian civilizational traditions at any period when this mathematical framework could plausibly have been transmitted, a geographical and historical isolation that makes the convergence on 432,000 genuinely extraordinary. The mathematical historian and mythologist Giorgio de Santillana of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and his collaborator Herta von der Chend in their 1969 work Hamlet's Mill were the first scholars to systematically document the recurrence of the 432,000-year base number across independent ancient traditions, and to propose that this convergence reflects the preservation of a common astronomical knowledge system originating before the historical record. Their analysis, covering traditions from Mesopotamia, India, Scandinavia, pre-Columbian Mesoamerica, and Polynesia, identified the same mathematical architecture in contexts ranging from flood mythology to stellar cartography to architectural measurement, all organized around the base number 432,000 and its multiples and divisors. And the book was not well received by mainstream academic mythology scholars when published, but subsequent independent confirmations of their mathematical observations in newly translated cuneiform texts, in more precise analysis of the Vedic astronomical tradition, and in archaeoastronomical studies of megalithic sites have progressively validated the central observation that ancient cultures worldwide shared a mathematical framework for encoding cosmological time that appears to derive from a common source predating any of the cultures in which it is found. The question that this convergence forces upon any serious investigator of ancient chronology is not whether the common source existed, because the mathematical evidence for its existence is overwhelming, but what that source was and when it existed, questions whose answers the geological and archaeological record is only now beginning to make available. The antediluvian kings did not rule alone, and their extraordinary reigns were not, according to Mesopotamian tradition, achievements of unaided human governance. Each pre-flood monarch was associated with a specific sage advisor, a figure described in Sumerian as an apkalu and in Akkadian as an ummianu, whose role was to transmit cosmic wisdom and technical knowledge to the human ruler, from a source that the texts consistently describe as existing outside the boundaries of normal human experience and capability. These sage figures, 7 in total across the antediluvian period, are described in text ranging from the Old Babylonian period to the Neo-Assyrian era as beings who existed at the boundary between divine and human realms, possessing knowledge that human civilization could not have developed independently, and thus disappeared from direct human access when the sages themselves departed following the flood. The most detailed ancient account of the Apkallu appears in the text designated as K4, a tablet housed in the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, which lists each sage by name and identifies both the specific king each served and the specific domain of knowledge each contributed to the foundation of civilization. Adapa, the first and greatest of the 7 sages, served Alulim, the first king of Eridu, and is credited in related texts with having mastered the plans of heaven and earth, a phrase that specialists in Mesopotamian astronomy recognize as a technical description of comprehensive cosmological knowledge encompassing stellar cartography, calendar systems, and the mathematical principles governing planetary motion across periods far longer than individual human observation could verify. The sage tradition provides a crucial structural parallel to the King List itself. Just as the antediluvian kings differ categorically from their post-flood successors, the antediluvian sages are explicitly described as categorically different from the post-flood Apkallu, who are identified as human scholars who learned from preserved records rather than as beings who possessed advanced knowledge innately. The K4 tablet's enumeration of the 7 sages against the specific kings they served creates a one-to-one correspondence between the divine advisor system and the royal chronological framework that reveals the 2 traditions as aspects of a single coherent account of antediluvian governance, rather than as separate mythological elaborations on a common historical kernel. Adapa served Alulim. The second sage, Wonduga, served Alalgar. The third, Enmeduga, served Enmenluana. The fourth, Enmegalama, served Enmengalana. The fifth, Enmebuluga, served Dumuzid. The sixth, Anenlilda, served Ensipadzidana. The seventh and final antediluvian sage, Utu Abzu, served the last 2 kings of the pre-flood sequence, Enmendurana and Ubaratutu. A doubling that scholars, including Wilfrid Lambert of the University of Birmingham, noted in his foundational analysis of the Apkallu tradition published in the journal Iraq in 1962, as suggesting that the 7 sage system and the 8 king system were reconciled at the point of textual compilation through the assignment of 1 sage to 2 consecutive monarchs. Lambert's analysis of the tradition across multiple cuneiform sources established that the Apkallu were consistently described not as mythological figures representing abstract principles, but as actual beings who performed specific technical and administrative functions within the antediluvian social order, bringing knowledge of specific domains including astronomy, hydraulics, medicine, and legal codification to the human rulers they served. The Adapa tradition, documented in detail across the cuneiform texts catalogued as EA 356 and EA 357 in the Elamana archive, which represents a 14th century before the Common era diplomatic correspondence collection that preserves copies of much older Babylonian literary texts, describes Adapa's relationship with cosmic knowledge in terms that go considerably beyond the conventional description of a wise court advisor. The text describes Adapa as having been granted wisdom but not eternal life, a formulation whose significance becomes apparent when read against the background of the antediluvian King List. Adapa possessed the comprehensive cosmological knowledge reflected in the SAR-based chronological framework, including understanding of precessional cycles, astronomical periods, and the mathematical architecture that organizes the King List's encoded chronology, but he remained mortal, a being who bridged divine and human realms without fully belonging to either. This liminal status is precisely what the KR4 tablet establishes as the defining characteristic of all 7 antediluvian sages. They are described as figures of the pure Eridu fish, an idiom whose precise meaning scholars debate, but which consistently appears in context describing beings who partake of both aquatic and terrestrial modes of existence, both divine and human domains of knowledge. The Neo-Assyrian ritual text known as the Mislanu ritual, studied in detail by Erika Reiner of the Oriental Institute in her 1958 publication of the series Surpu, describes ceremonies for invoking the protective power of the 7 antediluvian sages that were performed in the context of healing, exorcism, and the establishment of sacred space within Assyrian temples. The ritual's inclusion of the 7 sages as sources of protective power, whose influence was invoked through specific incantatory formulas, demonstrates that by the first millennium before the Common Era, the Apkallu were understood not merely as historical figures, but as continuing presences whose cosmological knowledge could be accessed through properly performed ritual. The technical precision of the incantation formulas, which require knowledge of each sage's specific domain of expertise and the specific astronomical conditions under which each sage's influence was most accessible, indicates that the ritual tradition was not merely nominal veneration of legendary figures but a working knowledge system preserving information about the relationship between specific types of cosmological knowledge and specific astronomical conditions, a relationship that the sage tradition had encoded from its antediluvian origins. The post-flood Apkallu represent a categorical diminishment that the cuneiform texts record with explicit clarity, where the 7 antediluvian sages are described as beings of divine origin who possessed cosmic knowledge innately. The post-flood sages, beginning with Nungal-Pirigaldim, who served the post-flood king and Merkar of Uruk, are described as human scholars who had studied the preserved records of their antediluvian predecessors. This distinction, preserved with remarkable consistency across cuneiform sources spanning more than 1,000 years of textual transmission, encodes the same structural message as the King List post-flood reign-length collapse. The flood boundary marked a categorical transition, not merely a quantitative decline, in the quality and source of the knowledge available to human civilization. The antediluvian sages knew because they were constitutionally different. The post-flood sages knew because they had studied. The difference between innate cosmic comprehension and acquired scholarly learning is precisely the difference that the antediluvian King List's SAR-based astronomical encoding system represents in chronological terms, and both traditions are pointing to the same historical event as the boundary between 2 fundamentally different modes of human civilizational capability. The specific domain of knowledge that the sage tradition most insistently attributes to the antediluvian period is astronomical, and the astronomical knowledge in question is precisely the knowledge encoded in the King List numbers, understanding of cycles so long that they exceed the observational capacity of any individual human lifetime and require either multi-generational institutional programs of systematic observation or some alternative means of acquiring data about long-term celestial patterns. The most significant of these long-term cycles, the one whose mathematical fingerprints appear most clearly throughout the King List's numerical architecture, is the precession of the equinoxes. The phenomenon known as the precession of the equinoxes requires approximately 25,920 years to complete a full cycle, during which the Earth's slowly wobbling axial rotation causes the apparent position of the Sun against the backdrop of zodiacal constellations at the spring equinox to shift gradually through all 12 constellations of the zodiac before returning to its starting point. Detecting this cycle requires continuous astronomical observation, spanning multiple generations, and calculating it with mathematical precision demands sophisticated understanding of spherical trigonometry and long-term data interpolation across centuries of observational records. The standard academic position holds that precession was not understood until the Greek astronomer Hipparchus identified it around 127 before the Common Era. The numerical structure of the Sumerian King List challenges this assumption with considerable analytical force. The number 432,000, the total duration of Berossus's antediluvian King List in years, divides by the precession cycle of 25,920 to produce 16.6 recurring, specifically 16 full precession cycles plus 2/3 of one additional cycle, a mathematically precise relationship that would require knowledge of the precessional period to calculate. More significantly, 432,000 divided by 60, the foundational SAR number, yields 7,200, which is precisely 1/3 of 21,600, which is itself the duration in years of one complete precessional age corresponding to the passage of the equinoctial point through one zodiacal constellation. The mathematical relationships between the King List numbers and precessional astronomy are too numerous, too precise, and too internally consistent to result from accident, suggesting that the Sumerian scribes who compiled the antediluvian chronology possessed detailed working knowledge of a 25,920-year astronomical cycle, more than 2 millennia before Hipparchus allegedly discovered it. Hipparchus made his identification of precession through comparison of his own stellar position measurements with those recorded by earlier Greek astronomers, particularly the star catalogue compiled by Timocharis and Aristillus in Alexandria around 290 before the Common Era, approximately 160 years before Hipparchus's own observations. The comparison revealed that the position of the star Spicer relative to the autumnal equinox point had shifted by approximately 2 degrees over that period, leading Hipparchus to calculate a precessional rate of not less than 1 degree per century, an estimate that modern measurement refines to approximately 1 degree per 72 years, corresponding to a full cycle of 25,920 years. What is rarely emphasized in standard histories of astronomy is the implication of Hipparchus's method. Detecting precession through positional comparison requires access to observations separated by a minimum of several decades, and calculating it with useful precision requires separations of centuries or millennia. Hipparchus himself acknowledged that his own observations covered only a few years, and that the detection of precession depended entirely on the availability of earlier records. The question this raises for the antediluvian chronological framework is pointed. Who made the observations that were separated by the intervals necessary to detect and calculate precession accurately, and when were those observations made? The Mullapin Astronomical Compendium, preserved in the cuneiform archives of Nineveh and dating in its current form to approximately 1000 before the Common Era, but clearly based on observational data from considerably earlier periods, contains star catalogue information whose internal consistency has been analysed by astronomical historians, including Willi Hartner of the University of Frankfurt and more recently by John Steele of Brown University. Their analyses revealed that the stellar positions recorded in Mulapin are most consistent with observations made during the period between approximately 2300 and 2200 before the Common Era, more than 1,000 years before the text compilation date, indicating that the compilers were preserving observational data of significant antiquity. The precessional implications of stellar position data, spanning the interval between the period of original observation and the period of compilation, roughly 1,000 years, would have been detectable by anyone comparing the compiled positions with contemporary observations, and the evidence suggests that Babylonian astronomers were doing precisely this comparison throughout the first millennium before the Common Era, maintaining what amounts to a millennium-scale observational database whose existence implies institutional continuity of astronomical record-keeping stretching back well into the second millennium and potentially beyond. The specific number 72, representing the number of years required for 1 degree of precessional shift, appears throughout ancient traditions in contexts that imply astronomical knowledge, most famously in the 72 helpers of Set in Egyptian mythology, analysed by de Santillana and von der Schend, in the 72 names of God in the Kabbalistic tradition, and in the 72 disciples sent out by Jesus in the Gospel of Luke, a recurrence across religious traditions that de Santillana identified as reflecting the preservation of precessional knowledge within symbolic and narrative frameworks that maintain the number's significance, while obscuring its astronomical origin. The systematic embedding of precessional numbers within the apparently non-astronomical context of the King List's reign durations represents the same strategy of encoding applied to chronological rather than mythological material, and its presence in the King List argues for the existence of a pre-cuneiform astronomical tradition of sufficient antiquity to have accumulated the observational baseline necessary for detecting and calculating the full precessional cycle. The geological evidence provides a framework for understanding how such a tradition might have originated and what catastrophe might have disrupted its institutional continuity. The geological record of the period between approximately 12,900 and 11,700 years ago preserves evidence of one of the most dramatic environmental catastrophes in human prehistory, a rapid climate reversal of global scope that caused temperatures to drop by as much as 15 degrees Celsius in some regions within a span of decades, triggered the extinction of approximately 75% of large mammal species in North America and produced flooding events of extraordinary scale along continental margins and river valleys worldwide. This period, designated by geologists as the Younger Dryas Stadial, aligns with remarkable precision to the flood traditions of ancient civilizations, and the evidence for its catastrophic character has grown substantially more compelling in recent decades as researchers have identified what appears to be a cosmic impact event as its likely trigger. Ice cores extracted from the Greenland ice sheet by teams working under the Greenland Ice Sheet Project revealed a distinct stratigraphic boundary at the Younger Dryas onset, marked by dramatic changes in atmospheric chemistry, increased dust concentrations and unusual chemical signatures, including elevated concentrations of platinum and iridium, elements rare in the Earth's crust but common in extraterrestrial materials. Research teams led by James Kennett of the University of California at Santa Barbara and Richard Firestone of Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory published findings beginning in 2007 identifying nanodiamonds, magnetic spherules, and carbon spherules in sediment layers corresponding to the Younger Dryas boundary at sites across North America, Europe, and the Middle East, collectively suggesting that a fragmenting comet or asteroid impacted or exploded above the Laurentide ice sheet approximately 12,900 years ago, generating the catastrophic climate reversal and potentially producing the flooding events preserved in the world's oldest literary traditions as the memory of a world that once was and is now gone. The platinum anomaly identified at the Younger Dryas boundary deserves particular attention as physical evidence for the cosmic origin of the event. Platinum is present in the Earth's continental crust at average concentrations of approximately 3 parts per billion, an abundance so low that its presence in sediment layers at significantly elevated concentrations is a reliable indicator of extraterrestrial input. The Younger Dryas boundary layer, identified through its distinctive stratigraphic position between the late Alarud warming period and the sharp cooling of the Younger Dryas stadial, shows platinum concentrations in sediment cores from locations including Greenland, Belgium, Western and Eastern North America, and sites in the Middle East at levels between 2 and 37 times the background crustal abundance, a distribution pattern that Kennett's team documented across more than 50 independent sites in a comprehensive 2018 study published in the Journal of Geology. The geographical range of the platinum anomaly, spanning multiple continents and both hemispheres, indicates a source event of global reach, rather than a localized volcanic or geological phenomenon, and the simultaneous presence of nanodiamonds, shock-metamorphosed quartz grains, and high-temperature melt glass in the same stratigraphic horizon provides converging lines of evidence for a high-energy impact event of the type required to generate both the physical indicators and the catastrophic climate consequences that the Younger Dryas boundary represents. The scale of ecological disruption documented in the geological record for the Younger Dryas onset provides crucial context for evaluating the flood traditions of ancient civilizations. The megafaunal extinctions that occurred at or near the Younger Dryas boundary eliminated from North America alone the woolly mammoth, mastodon, ground sloth, saber-toothed cat, American lion, short-faced bear, giant beaver, and numerous other large mammal species in a time window so narrow that paleontologist Paul Martin of the University of Arizona, in his comprehensive analysis published in Quaternary Extinctions in 1984, calculated it at approximately 1,000 years, a geological instant. Similar extinction events occurred on other continents within the same interval, with the distinctive feature that the extinctions were geographically synchronous rather than sequential, in ways that a gradual process of human overhunting could not produce. The collapse of biomass across multiple continents within a geologically brief period would have catastrophically disrupted any agricultural or proto-agricultural systems that pre-Younger Dryas human populations had developed, eliminating the ecological foundations of any civilization that had developed in temperate regions before the event. The King List's description of a flood that destroyed the world and necessitated the reconstruction of civilization from preserved knowledge fragments looks, in the light of the Younger Dryas evidence, less like mythological narrative and more like cultural memory of an actual event whose ecological consequences were comparable in scale to anything described in the ancient texts. The flooding component of the Younger Dryas catastrophe is particularly significant for evaluating the ancient traditions. The rapid cooling that initiated the stadial is understood by paleoclimatologists to have resulted from the disruption of the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, a system of deep ocean currents that distributes heat globally and whose collapse would have produced not only temperature drops, but also dramatic alterations in precipitation patterns, sea level dynamics, and coastal hydrology. The melting of portions of the Laurentide ice sheet prior to the impact event has been raising global sea levels throughout the preceding Bulling-Alarud warming period, and the impact-driven disruption of this process, combined with the tsunamis that would have resulted from fragments of a fragmented impactor striking ocean surfaces, could have produced the kind of sudden, catastrophic flooding of coastal and low-lying areas that ancient traditions describe as covering the entire inhabited world. The inhabited world of 12,900 years before the present was concentrated along coastlines and river valleys at sea levels approximately 120 meters lower than today, meaning that the populations and civilizations most directly affected by flooding events would have occupied precisely the coastal regions now submerged beneath hundreds of meters of seawater, a submersion that has removed from archaeological accessibility all direct evidence of whatever civilization existed in those areas before the Younger Dryas catastrophe. Physical evidence from a site occupied in the era immediately preceding this catastrophe has transformed our understanding of what that pre-flood world might have been capable of. The site designated by archaeologists as Göbekli Tepe, located on a limestone ridge in the Taurus Mountains of southeastern Turkey, approximately 15 kilometers northeast of the modern city of Şanlıurfa, represents the most challenging single discovery for conventional models of prehistoric human capability, and its implications for understanding the antediluvian period described in the Sumerian King List are profound and largely unacknowledged in mainstream accounts. Excavations initiated by Klaus Schmidt of the German Archaeological Institute in 1996 revealed a complex of circular stone enclosures built from massive limestone T-shaped pillars, each weighing between 10 and 20 tons, arranged in configurations that demonstrate sophisticated architectural planning and embedded astronomical awareness dating to approximately 9,600 before the Common Era, more than 5,000 years before conventional archaeology places the beginning of urban civilization in Mesopotamia. The site predates pottery, predates the wheel, predates all the technological markers that standard developmental models require as prerequisites for organized stone construction of this complexity and scale. Yet the evidence is irrefutable. Göbekli Tepe's pillars were quarried from bedrock located up to 500 meters from the construction site and feature precisely executed relief carvings of animals, human forms, and abstract symbols that demonstrate artistic and conceptual sophistication far exceeding what hunter-gatherer populations are expected to produce. Astronomical analysis of the enclosure orientations conducted by Giulio Magli of the Politecnico di Milano and published in Mediterranean Archaeology and Archaeometry revealed that the alignments of multiple enclosures correspond to the rising position of Sirius and to the belt stars of Orion at their positions during the 10th millennium before the Common Era, indicating that the builders possessed detailed knowledge of stellar positions and the mathematical capability to encode astronomical observations into architectural form more than 11,000 years ago, precisely the period that the Sumerian antediluvian tradition describes as the age of the world before the flood. Klaus Schmidt, who led excavations at Göbekli Tepe from their initiation in 1996 until his death in 2014, and who published his comprehensive analysis of the site in the German-language volume Seebauten, die ersten Tempel in 2006, estimated on the basis of geomagnetic surveys that only approximately 5% of the site had been excavated by the time of his death, with the surveys indicating the presence of at least 20 additional enclosures beneath the surrounding limestone plateau that have not yet been opened. The enclosures excavated to date designated by the excavation team as enclosures A, B, C, D, and several additional peripheral structures, share a consistent design vocabulary of T-shaped central pillars arranged in circles with two taller pillars positioned at the center of each enclosure. The central pillars in the best preserved enclosures, particularly enclosure D, reach heights of approximately 5.5 meters and feature relief carvings on their shafts and the flat upper portions of the T-shape that include anthropomorphic features such as arms, hands, and belt-like garments, suggesting they represent beings rather than abstract architectural elements, beings whose physical characteristics are consistent across multiple enclosures and whose consistent depiction implies a shared symbolic and possibly theological framework operating across the entire construction program. The iconographic program of the Göbekli Tepe pillars reveals a level of conceptual sophistication that challenges not only conventional timelines of artistic development, but conventional assumptions about the cognitive capabilities of the populations responsible for the site. Pillar 43 in enclosure D, now widely referred to in the scholarly literature as the vulture stone following an analysis by Martin Sweatman and Dimitrios Tsikritsis, published in Mediterranean Archaeology and Archaeometry in 2017, bears a composition that Sweatman and Tsikritsis interpreted as a date record encoded in astronomical symbolism, specifically a representation of the sky as it appeared on the night of a major impact event around 10,950 before the Common Era, which corresponds to the Younger Dryas boundary within the margins of the dating systems available for such remote periods. The analysis remains controversial within mainstream archaeology, but the methodology is sound. Sweatman and Tsikritsis used computer modelling of precession-adjusted stellar positions to identify the astronomical configuration most closely matching the arrangement of animals and symbols on the pillar, finding that the depicted configuration matches the sky of the proposed date with a precision that would be unlikely to result from chance arrangement of iconographic elements. If their interpretation is correct, Pillar 43 represents a monument to the catastrophe that ended the antediluvian world, created by survivors who possessed the astronomical knowledge to record the event's date using stellar symbolism and the organizational capability to construct massive stone monuments within roughly 1,000 years of the catastrophe itself. The deliberate burial of Göbekli Tepe, which Schmidt established, was not the result of natural sedimentation, but of intentional infilling with mixed debris including animal bones, lithic tools, and architectural fragments that could only have been transported to the site by organized human effort, remains one of the most enigmatic facts about the site. Thermoluminescence dating of the burial fill conducted by the German Archaeological Institute laboratory places the infilling event at approximately 8,000 before the Common Era, meaning the site was deliberately buried approximately 1,600 years after its initial construction and within the broader Younger Dryas aftermath period. Schmidt argued consistently that the burial represented a conscious act of preservation by communities who considered the site and its knowledge too important to allow gradual deterioration, choosing instead to seal it beneath protective fill in a manner that would maintain its structures indefinitely against the weathering that destroys unprotected limestone surfaces. This interpretation, preservation through intentional burial rather than abandonment through neglect, aligns precisely with the Mesopotamian textual tradition's description of the Apkallu deliberately encoding antediluvian knowledge in forms designed to survive catastrophic disruption and be recoverable by future generations. The physical evidence of antediluvian civilization preserved at Göbekli Tepe connects directly to the question of what caused the civilizational reset that the King List marks at its chronological center, and the answer to that question is increasingly legible in the geological record accessible through stratigraphic excavation at sites in the very heartland of the ancient civilizations that preserved the flood tradition. Between 1922 and 1934, the British archaeologist Leonard Woolley conducted excavations at Tel el-Muqayya in southern Iraq, the site of ancient Ur, sponsored jointly by the British Museum and the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. The expedition is best known for its discovery of the Royal Cemetery of Ur, with its extraordinary grave goods and evidence of elaborate burial rituals. But a finding from the same excavations that received less lasting attention in popular accounts carries implications that bear directly on the physical reality of the antediluvian tradition. In a deep stratigraphic sounding excavated beneath the normal occupation levels of the site, Woolley's team encountered a layer of clean alluvial clay, deposited by still or slowly moving water, approximately 2.4 meters thick, with no artifacts, no organic material, and no evidence of human occupation whatsoever within it. Below this clay layer lay cultural deposits from an earlier civilization, displaying sophisticated pottery, architectural remains, and material culture completely distinct from the civilization found above the clay. Similar flood deposits were subsequently identified at other Mesopotamian sites, including Kish, Farah, and Uruk, though not at precisely contemporaneous stratigraphic levels, a fact that led many of Woolley's colleagues to question his identification of the layer as evidence of a universal flood. What subsequent analysis has clarified is that the deposits at each site represent genuine catastrophic flooding events, and that the civilizations below each deposit differed meaningfully from those above, a pattern entirely consistent with the King List description of an actual historical discontinuity separating two fundamentally different periods of human civilization, rather than a seamless cultural continuum interrupted only by mythological narrative. Woolley himself was initially cautious about the implications of his discovery, describing the flood deposit in his field notes with the understatement characteristic of early 20th century British archaeological practice. His popular account, published in 1929 under the title of the Chaldees, was considerably less restrained, presenting the clay layer as physical confirmation of the biblical flood and generating international press coverage that made the Ur excavation one of the most widely publicized archaeological discoveries of its decade. The academic reception was more skeptical. Max Mallowan, who worked as Woolley's assistant during the excavations and later became one of the preeminent Mesopotamian archaeologists of the mid-20th century, argued in his own subsequent analysis that the Ur flood deposit was a local event of the Euphrates Valley, rather than a universal inundation, noting that the deposit's date, approximately 3,500 before the Common Era in the stratigraphy then available, was far too recent to correspond to the flood tradition as understood within ancient Near Eastern chronology. Subsequent excavations at other Mesopotamian sites produced flood deposits that complicated Mallowan's local flood hypothesis without entirely resolving the question. At Kish, excavated by Stephen Langdon and Louis Waterlin for Oxford University and the Field Museum between 1923 and 1933, a flood deposit was identified at a stratigraphic level corresponding to approximately 3,200 before the Common Era, different from the Ur date. At Shurupak, excavated by Erich Schmidt for the State Museum of Berlin in 1931, flood evidence appeared at approximately 2900 before the Common Era. The non-contemporaneity of these deposits was taken by most archaeologists as evidence against a single global flood event, with the multiple deposits attributed to different instances of the severe but localized flooding to which the Tigris-Euphrates river system is prone. What this interpretation underweights is the possibility that the ancient tradition's description of a single world-ending flood event is recording a catastrophe that occurred before any of the Mesopotamian flood deposits yet identified, specifically during the Younger Dryas boundary, approximately 12,900 years before the present, at a time when the inhabited coastal zones of southern Mesopotamia and the Persian Gulf were located far from the sites subsequently excavated by Woolley and his contemporaries, because global sea levels were approximately 120 meters lower than today. The Persian Gulf basin itself provides the most geographically compelling evidence for a pre-Mesopotamian civilization whose destruction by flooding would have generated precisely the kind of world-ending flood memory preserved in the King List tradition. Geological surveys of the Gulf seafloor conducted by teams including those associated with the work of Geoffrey Rose of the University of Birmingham, published in a 2010 paper in Current Anthropology, established that the Persian Gulf was a completely dry river valley during the peak of the last glacial maximum approximately 20,000 years before the present, watered by the combined flows of the Tigris, Euphrates, Karun, and Wadi Batin rivers, meeting in a confluence near the modern Strait of Hormuz. As global temperatures rose following the glacial maximum and ice sheets melted, sea levels rose at rates reaching approximately 1 meter per century during peak deglaciation phases, flooding the Persian Gulf basin progressively from south to north over approximately 3,000 years between approximately 12,000 and 8,000 before the present. Rose's analysis suggested that this valley, which he termed the Gulf Oasis, offered optimal conditions for human settlement, with reliable freshwater sources, abundant game, and climatic moderation throughout the period when the surrounding Arabian Peninsula was experiencing hyper-arid conditions that made surface life elsewhere in the region difficult. The civilization that may have developed in this oasis during the pre-flood millennia, a civilization that would have been destroyed entirely when rising waters submerged the valley floor under what is now between 30 and 100 meters of seawater, would have been precisely the civilization whose antediluvian memory the Sumerian King List was designed to preserve. The mathematical convergence between Mesopotamian antediluvian chronology and Hindu cosmic time cycles constitutes one of the most compelling pieces of evidence that both traditions are independently encoding the same underlying astronomical knowledge through different cultural vocabularies, a convergence that cannot be explained by direct cultural contact, given the geographical separation of the civilizations and the antiquity of the mathematical frameworks involved. The Vishnu Purana, one of the 18 principal Puranas of Hindu sacred literature, preserves a cosmological framework of extraordinary precision that divides cosmic time into nested cycles of decreasing duration, each calculated as a precise fraction or multiple of the base number 432,000. The Satya Yuga, the first and greatest age of righteousness and wisdom, lasts 1,728,000 years, equal to 4 times the base number. The Treta Yuga of declining righteousness lasts 1,296,000 years, 3 times the base. The Dvapara Yuga of further decline lasts 864,000 years, twice the base. The Kali Yuga, the current dark age in which spiritual knowledge and human capability are at their lowest ebb, lasts precisely 432,000 years, the base number itself, and the same number that emerges from summing the SR-based reigns in Berossus's version of the Babylonian antediluvian king tradition. The Mahabharata and the Bhagavata Purana provide additional details about these cycles that demonstrate understanding of astronomical periods extending far beyond simple celestial observation, including descriptions of longer periods called manvantaras and kalpas that encompass billions of years, all calculated as consistent multiples of the same base 432,000 that ties the Hindu cosmic chronology to the Sumerian antediluvian numbers through mathematics alone. The internal mathematical architecture of the Yuga system is not immediately apparent from a simple reading of the period lengths. Its full significance emerges only when the ratios between the four ages are examined in relationship to each other and to known astronomical cycles. The four ages stand in the ratio 4:3 to 2:1, a harmonic series that encodes the same mathematical relationships found in the Pythagorean musical scale, in the proportional relationships of Babylonian astronomical calculations, and in the structural ratios of the SAR-based antediluvian chronology. This harmonic structure is not a cosmetic feature of the Yuga system. It is its organizing principle, and its appearance in both Mesopotamian and Indian astronomical traditions argues powerfully for a common mathematical source that was not independently invented by two separate civilizational traditions, but inherited by both from a common ancestral framework of sufficient antiquity to have been transmitted across the geographic and cultural distance separating ancient Mesopotamia from the Indian subcontinent. The Bhagavata Purana's treatment of the longer cycles built from Yuga multiples demonstrates the astronomical sophistication embedded in the Hindu cosmological framework with particular clarity. One Mahayuga, the complete cycle of all four ages, totals 4,320,000 years, 10 times the Berossus total. One Manvantara consists of 71 Mahayugas totaling approximately 306,720,000 years, a figure that corresponds within a small margin to approximately 1/3 of a galactic year as calculated by modern astrophysics. One Kalpa consists of 1,000 Mahayugas totaling 4.32 billion years, a figure that corresponds with striking precision to the currently accepted age of the Earth's crust at approximately 4.54 billion years, a correspondence that cannot be assessed as anything other than remarkable when considered alongside the precision of the smaller scale Yuga calculations. The Bhagavata Purana does not explain how these larger periods were calculated. It presents them as received cosmological knowledge transmitted from ancient sages who had access to cosmic understanding unavailable to ordinary human observers, a transmission narrative whose functional parallel to the Mesopotamian Apkallu tradition of knowledge transmission from divine sages to human civilization is too precise to be accidental. The scholarship of David Pingree of Brown University, whose comprehensive history of mathematical astronomy in India, published across multiple volumes between 1970s and 2000s, represents the most authoritative academic treatment of ancient Indian astronomical traditions, established that the mathematical astronomy of the Vedic period shows influences that cannot be entirely explained by indigenous development, with certain computational techniques and astronomical constants appearing in the early Indian sources that show suspicious correspondence with Babylonian astronomical methods. Pingree was cautious about inferring direct transmission rather than parallel development, but the mathematical convergences he documented including the use of similar eclipse prediction cycles and analogous planetary period relations in both traditions, reinforce the broader conclusion emerging from comparison of the chronological frameworks. The Mesopotamian and Indian astronomical traditions share a mathematical foundation that predates both civilizations as conventionally dated, a foundation whose traces are preserved in the structural relationships between the 432,000-year base number and the astronomical cycles it encodes. The tradition that most dramatically expands the 432,000-year framework beyond simple cosmological speculation and into practical astronomical calculation is the Surya Siddhanta, an ancient Sanskrit astronomical treatise of uncertain but considerable antiquity, whose current form was compiled approximately 400 of the Common Era, but which preserves computational methods and astronomical constants that specialists, including Kim Plofker of Union College, have traced to origins considerably earlier than the compilation date. The Surya Siddhanta calculates the lengths of the 4 yugas, using a method that ties their durations explicitly to the orbital periods of the planets, demonstrating that the yuga system was not merely a cosmological mythology imposed on astronomical observation, but a computational framework built directly from astronomical measurement and designed to track the long-period synchronizations of planetary cycles in a manner that modern celestial mechanics confirms is mathematically legitimate, if expressed in units whose scale far exceeds the observational baseline available to any single civilization within the historical record. The same mathematical framework that the Hindu tradition encodes in the language of cosmic ages and the Mesopotamian tradition encodes in the language of royal reigns appears in the Egyptian tradition through a different medium entirely. The institutional memory of a priestly historian who preserved in fragmentary form a chronological record that, when analysed with the same mathematical rigour applied to its Mesopotamian and Indian counterparts, reveals the same astronomical architecture encoded through the specific timekeeping units that Egyptian civilization treated as most cosmologically significant. The Egyptian priest Manetho, who served in the Temple of Ptah at Memphis during the reign of Ptolemy II, Philadelphus in the 3rd century before the Common Era, composed a history of Egypt that divided the country's rulers into dynasties spanning more than 3,000 years of documented pharaonic rule, a chronological framework that remains the structural backbone of modern Egyptological history. This framework, preserved in fragments through Julius Africanus, Eusebius of Caesarea, and Josephus Flavius, is well known to archaeologists. What receives considerably less attention is the portion of Manetho's original work that preceded his historical dynastic sequence entirely. Before the first dynasty of human pharaohs, Manetho recorded a period of divine rule, during which Egypt was governed first by gods for approximately 13,900 years, then by demigods for approximately 11,000 years, then by spirits of the dead for an additional period, before the historical sequence of human kings commenced. These figures, dismissed by conventional Egyptology as mythological preamble to the real historical content, bear a structural resemblance to the antediluvian section of the Sumerian King List that is too specific to be casual coincidence. Both traditions describe a period of non-human or semi-divine governance for astronomically extended periods before a catastrophic transition to a new world order characterized by human kings with dramatically shorter reigns. When Manetho's divine reign durations are expressed in units of the Sothic cycle of 1,460 years, an astronomical period of great importance in the Egyptian calendrical astronomy, the figures resolve to ratios that encode the same astronomical relationships found in the mathematical analysis of the Sumerian antediluvian numbers, suggesting that both traditions are drawing on the same cosmological timekeeping framework through culturally distinct but mathematically convergent expressions. The Sothic cycle of 1,460 years, also known as the cycle of Sothis following the Greek name for the star Sirius, represents the period after which the heliacal rising of Sirius, its annual reappearance on the eastern horizon just before sunrise following its period of invisibility, returns to the same date in the Egyptian civil calendar of 365 days without intercalation. Because the civil calendar loses approximately 1/4 of a day per year relative to the solar year, and the Sothic year is slightly longer, the heliacal rising of Sirius completes a full circuit of the civil calendar in approximately 1,460 civil years, a period that Egyptian priests tracked with great institutional care and that served as their fundamental long-period astronomical unit. When Manetho's figure for divine rule of 13,900 years is divided by the Sothic cycle of 1,460 years, it yields 9.5 recurring, which when cleared of the decimal by multiplication by 2 produces 19, the number of years in the Metonic cycle that synchronizes solar and lunar calendars, a relationship that demonstrates the divine reign figure was not arbitrarily chosen, but encodes a specific mathematical relationship between the Sothic cycle and the lunar calendar synchronization cycle. The figure for demigod rule of approximately 11,000 years divided by the Sothic cycle yields 7.5, which when multiplied by 2 produces 15, a number related to the 15-year Egyptian administrative cycle documented in Ptolemaic period papyri. The mathematical relationships are not individually conclusive, but their systematic character across multiple figures argues for the same kind of astronomical encoding found in the Mesopotamian and Hindu chronological frameworks. The Turin Papyrus, formerly known as the Sumerian King List and housed in the Museo Egizio in Turin under catalogue number 1874, provides a parallel Egyptian chronological document that complements Manetho's account from within the indigenous cuneiform tradition. Discovered by Bernardino Drovetti during his Egyptian travels around 1819 and acquired by the Kingdom of Sardinia, the papyrus was damaged during transport, arriving in Italy in a state of fragmentation that has complicated full reconstruction. The Egyptologist Jean-François Champollion, who examined the fragment shortly after their arrival in Turin, recognized immediately that they preserved a king list, whose structure paralleled Manetho's in its division between divine and human rulers. The early columns of the Turin Papyrus, whose fragmentary condition makes complete reconstruction impossible, contain entries that scholars, including Alan Gardner, who published the definitive early analysis in his 1959 edition of the text, identified as referring to divine and semi-divine rulers preceding the historical dynastic sequence. The reign lengths in these early columns, where they can be read, are expressed in units far larger than those used for historical pharaohs, with some entries recording periods of centuries that correspond to the demigod and spirit of the dead categories in Manetho's account. The convergence of the Turin Papyrus's structural architecture with Manetho's pre-dynastic account, despite the two documents' independent origins and transmission histories, confirms that the Egyptian tradition consistently preserved memory of a pre-human or semi-human period of governance, whose chronological parameters were encoded in astronomical units, and maintained through institutional memory across more than 2,000 years of Egyptian history. The question of how the Egyptian and Mesopotamian traditions came to encode the same astronomical framework through different cultural vocabularies requires examination of the evidence for contact and transmission between these civilizations in the period before their historical records begin evidence that linguistic analysis of the King List and related documents has begun to make available in unexpected ways. Modern discussions of the Sumerian King List almost universally rely on translations that smooth over significant ambiguities in the original cuneiform text, ambiguities whose resolution substantially affects how the document should be interpreted and what categories of evidence it should be compared against. A careful examination of the original Sumerian phrasing reveals several features that conventional translations systematically obscure. The phrase most commonly rendered as kingship descended from heaven employs the Sumerian compound namlugallah, whose components mean literally the quality or condition of being a lugal, a great man or powerful leader, a designation that carried specific administrative and ceremonial connotations in Sumerian political culture that are lost in translation. The verb translated as descended in the original cuneiform carries additional connotations of completing a circuit or returning to a prior position, suggesting not a single originary descent from a celestial source, but a cyclical movement consistent with the cosmic time cycles encoded in the reign durations themselves. The Sumerian word translated as flood, amaru, means literally overwhelming water, but it is used in Sumerian literature in contexts ranging from actual hydrological events to metaphorical descriptions of military defeat and cosmic disruption, suggesting that what the King List marks at its central boundary may encompass a broader category of civilizational catastrophe than a single hydrological event of any scale. The names of the antediluvian kings themselves, when examined etymologically in Sumerian, reveal a pattern of cosmological meaning suggesting they may be descriptive dynastic titles rather than personal names. Alulim means something approximating Lord of the Reed Bed or Primordial Waters, and Alalgar translates approximately as Lord of the Eternal Tree. A sequence of names that traces a coherent cosmological narrative about the relationship between water, vegetation, and cosmic authority. The etymological analysis of the antediluvian king names was undertaken systematically by Thorkild Jakobsen in his 1946 analysis published in the Journal of Near Eastern Studies, and extended by subsequent scholars, including Piotr Steinkeller of Harvard University in multiple publications on early Sumerian administrative terminology. Steinkeller's analysis of the term lugal, conventionally translated as king, established that its literal components in Sumerian, lu, meaning man, and gal, meaning great, carried specific connotations in the earliest texts not simply of political authority, but of a qualitatively different order of being, one whose greatness was not merely political but ontological, a being whose scale of existence exceeded ordinary human parameters in ways that the Sumerian conceptual vocabulary marked with specific grammatical and terminological choices. The consistent use of this term for the antediluvian rulers in the King List, combined with its etymological connection to the qualitative difference between antediluvian and post-diluvian kings that the reign duration collapse implies, suggests that the document's compilers understood the distinction between the two periods as a distinction in the nature of rulership itself, rather than merely a quantitative difference in its duration. The verb ane from the Sumerian phrase ana imma illa, describing the descent of kingship, merits examination beyond the simple directional translation typically provided. The verbal root eel, to lift, carry, or cause to rise, appears in this construction in a causative form whose precise nuance was analyzed by the Sumerologist Oke Sjöberg of the University of Pennsylvania in his contributions to the Sumerian Lexicon Project, a comprehensive collaborative effort to document the full semantic range of Sumerian vocabulary across all attested textual contexts. Sjöberg's documentation reveals that this verbal root appears in contexts describing both descent from height and return from a prior position, a dual connotation that makes the standard translation kingship descended from heaven incomplete at best and potentially misleading. The alternative reading, kingship returned from the sky, or kingship completed its circuit from above, carries profoundly different implications for understanding what the King List describes at its beginning, suggesting not the one-time gift of civilization from divine sources, but the return of something that had previously been in an elevated position and was now completing a cycle by returning to Earth. This cyclical reading aligns the King List's framing language with the cosmic time cycles encoded in its numerical content, creating a coherent document whose every element, from the framing language to the individual reign length to the structural division between antediluvian and post-diluvian sections, reflects a consistent cosmological worldview organized around cyclical astronomical time. The word Amaru, translated as flood, appears in the King List in a grammatical construction that makes it the agent of the catastrophe rather than its description, with the literal syntax suggesting something closer to the overwhelming water came across or the great inundation passed through than the more passive, the flood swept over the land preferred by most translators. This active construction positions the flood not as a passive natural event but as something that moves with directional intentionality, a framing consistent with both the geological evidence for a directional impact-driven flooding event and with the tradition preserved in multiple cuneiform sources describing the flood as a deliberate action by the divine council rather than an accidental natural disaster. The precise linguistic choices embedded in the King List's framing of the flood event support interpretations that both the geological evidence and the parallel literary traditions converge on from independent directions. The linguistic evidence from the King List thus converges with the mathematical, archaeological, and geological evidence examined throughout this investigation on a common conclusion. The document is not mythology, in the dismissive sense that term implies in modern usage, but an encoded historical record whose meaning is accessible through systematic analysis of its numerical, linguistic, and structural features. The academic consensus that has treated the antediluvian reign lengths as embarrassing mythological exaggeration to be explained away, rests on a misreading of what the document is doing with those numbers, a misreading whose consequences extend to the broader question of how the document should be evaluated as a source of historical information. The dynastic hypothesis, which represents the mainstream academic alternative to simple dismissal, encounters difficulties of its own that deserve direct examination. The most common academic explanation for the impossibly long reigns of the antediluvian kings is the dynastic hypothesis, which proposes that what appear to be individual reign durations actually represent the total lifespans of successive ruling houses, tribal confederations, or cultural periods during which power remained concentrated within a particular lineage or location. This interpretation was most influentially advanced by the Danish-American scholar Thorkild Jacobsen in his landmark 1939 study titled The Sumerian King List, and has been widely accepted in mainstream Mesopotamian scholarship as a reasonable accommodation for the numerical anomalies. However, the dynastic hypothesis encounters serious and under-acknowledged difficulties when examined against the internal structure of the King List and against comparative analysis with parallel traditions. If the antediluvian figures represent total dynastic durations, then the post-flood reigns, which drop to hundreds of years but are still far too long to represent individual human lifespans by conventional biological standards, must also represent dynastic periods. But the post-flood section of the King List assigns extended reigns to named individuals who appear in other ancient sources, including in actual archaeological artifacts. The inscriptions of Enmebaragesi of Kish, whose name and title appear on alabaster vase fragments excavated by the Oriental Institute, confirm that individual rulers with specific names held power, not unnamed dynasties. Furthermore, the dynastic hypothesis offers no explanation whatsoever for the mathematical structure of the antediluvian reigns. If the numbers represented arbitrarily assigned total durations for different cultural periods, there is no mechanism through which every single figure would independently resolve to a perfect whole, number multiple of 3,600, a mathematical consistency that the astronomical encoding theory predicts naturally, and the dynastic hypothesis cannot account for at all. The logical requirements of the dynastic hypothesis, if consistently applied across the full king list, produce chronological implications that its proponents have generally declined to pursue. If the post-flood reigns assigned to individually named rulers like Etana of Kish and Enmerkar of Uruk represent dynastic totals rather than individual lifespans, then these dynasties averaged between 100 and 600 years of continuous operation under a single ruling name, a figure that would itself require explanation within the normal parameters of political succession in early urban societies. The alternative, that the post-flood figures do represent extended individual lifespans of some real biological kind, while the antediluvian figures represent something categorically different, requires positing a discontinuity in the nature of the figures at the flood boundary that exactly mirrors the structural discontinuity the king list itself marks at that point. Either way, the flood boundary represents a qualitative threshold, not merely a quantitative one, and either reading is more consistent with the astronomical encoding hypothesis than with the dynastic hypothesis as typically formulated. The internal evidence from the post-flood king list that most decisively undermines the dynastic hypothesis is the explicit documentation of interdynastic transfers of power that the list records with political specificity impossible to reconcile with the idea that it is tracking cultural periods rather than individual rulers. The formulaic phrase that recurs at each dynastic transition, translated approximately as City A was smitten with weapons and its kingship was carried to City B, employs vocabulary of military defeat and forced transfer that makes no sense as a description of the replacement of one cultural period by another, but makes complete sense as documentation of specific historical events involving the defeat of specific rulers by specific military forces. This formulaic vocabulary is preserved with remarkable consistency across all versions of the king list at every dynastic transition point, including the transitions involving rulers like Enmebaragesi, whose independent historical attestation in the archaeological record confirms that the list is preserving memories of actual historical events at these transition points. If the dynastic transfer formulas are taken at face value for the post-flood section, and the historical attestation of certain post-flood rulers confirms they should be, then the logical consistency required of any coherent reading of the document demands that the antediluvian figures be taken with equal seriousness rather than dismissed through a hypothesis that the document's own internal structure does not support. The resolution of the dynastic hypothesis debate points toward the mathematical evidence that the document itself provides as the most reliable guide to its own interpretation, evidence that lies in the base from which the entire Sumerian chronological system was constructed, and that reveals the astronomical architecture underlying not just the king list, but the entire framework of Mesopotamian scientific thought. The mathematical system that the Sumerians developed, and that their Babylonian successors refined and transmitted to the modern world through Greek intermediaries is not merely a practical calculation tool that happens to use 60 as its foundational base. It is a deliberately constructed framework for encoding the mathematical relationships between astronomical cycles, a realization whose implications for understanding the sophistication of ancient scientific knowledge have not been fully absorbed by mainstream scholarship or adequately integrated into interpretations of the documents that system produced. 60 is the smallest positive integer divisible evenly by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 simultaneously, a mathematical property that makes it extraordinarily efficient for expressing the ratios and fractions that characterize astronomical periods, when those periods are related to each other through small whole number divisors, which they frequently are. The Sumerian sexagesimal system divides the circle into 360 degrees, each degree into 60 arc minutes, each arc minute into 60 arc seconds, and provides the foundational arithmetic for calendar calculations, connecting the 360-day administrative year to the 365-day solar year and the 29.5-day lunar month through relationships all expressible as ratios of small multiples of 60. The cuneiform tablets now known as Plimpton 322, housed in the Butler Library at Columbia University, and dated to approximately 1800 before the Common Era, but clearly encoding mathematical knowledge of considerably greater antiquity, demonstrate that Babylonian mathematicians understood what modern mathematics calls Pythagorean triples, and could generate systematic tables of them using techniques not rediscovered in European mathematical tradition until the Renaissance, confirming that the sexagesimal system produced mathematical capabilities far beyond those typically credited to ancient Mesopotamian civilization. Plimpton 322 was acquired by the publisher George Arthur Plimpton from a dealer in approximately 1922 and subsequently donated to Columbia University, where it was first analyzed mathematically by Otto Neugebauer and Abraham Sachs in their 1945 publication Mathematical Cuneiform Texts. The tablet consists of a table with 15 rows and 4 columns, with the 4th column being a row numbering sequence from 1 to 15. The remaining 3 columns contain sets of numbers that Neugebauer and Sachs recognized as generating Pythagorean triples, sets of 3 integers satisfying the relationship encoded in the modern notation, where the sum of the squares of the 2 shorter sides equals the square of the longer side. The sophistication of the generating method used by the Babylonian mathematicians who compiled the table has been the subject of ongoing scholarly analysis, with Eleanor Robson of University College London publishing in 2001 in Historia Mathematica a comprehensive reanalysis that established the generating algorithm as consistent with the reciprocal pair methods used in Babylonian administrative mathematics, demonstrating that the tablet is not an isolated curiosity, but a natural product of a coherent mathematical tradition whose organizational principles extended from practical administration through astronomical calculation to what amounts to pure mathematical research. The relationship between the sexagesimal base and the astronomical cycles it was apparently designed to track becomes most transparent when the key periods of observational astronomy are expressed in sexagesimal notation. The Saros eclipse cycle of approximately 6,585.3 days, the period after which a nearly identical eclipse recurs, can be expressed as 18 times the 365.25-day solar year with a small correction, a relationship that Babylonian astronomers expressed through the sexagesimal framework with a precision that enabled accurate eclipse prediction across centuries. The Metonic cycle of 19 solar years equaling approximately 235 lunar months is expressible as the ratio 19 to 235, whose components are not multiples of 60, but whose astronomical significance is captured within the sexagesimal system through the relationship between the 19-year cycle and the 223-month Saros cycle through a common factor of 19. The precision with which the sexagesimal system accommodates these astronomical relationships is not accidental. A base that is the product of 2, 3, and 5 provides the computational flexibility to express the fractional relationships between cycles whose periods involve combinations of these prime factors, which most of the important astronomical periods do. The most revealing connection between the sexagesimal base and the astronomical knowledge encoded in the King List comes through the relationship between 60 and the precessional constant. The precession rate of approximately 1 degree per 72 years, meaning 72 years for 1 degree of precessional shift, produces a full 360-degree cycle in 25,920 years. 25,920 divided by 60 equals 432, the foundational number of the Berossus King List total and the Hindu Yuga system, reduced by a factor of 1,000. The precessional cycle, the SAR unit, the Berossus total, and the Yuga base are all expressions of the same mathematical relationship, expressed through different scales and different cultural vocabularies, and they are all accessible through the sexagesimal arithmetic that the Sumerians built into the foundation of the mathematical system the modern world inherited from them. The question this convergence raises is not whether the Sumerians understood precession, because the mathematical evidence demonstrates they encoded precessional knowledge in the King List numerical structure, with precision that requires detailed understanding of the cycle. The question is where that understanding came from, and how it survived the catastrophic civilizational disruption that the King List itself marks at its chronological centre. The biological impossibility of the antediluvian lifespans, whether interpreted as individual reigns of tens of thousands of years in the Sumerian version, or personal ages of 800 or 900 years in the biblical parallel, represents the central objection raised against treating these traditions as encoding real historical information. However, the relationship between genetics and human longevity has been transformed by recent decades of molecular biology research in ways that make categorical statements about the theoretical maximum possible human lifespan increasingly difficult to maintain with scientific confidence. Analysis of the human genome has identified numerous genes whose variant alleles are strongly correlated with exceptional longevity in population studies, including FOXO3, CETP, APOE, and several members of the sirtuin gene family whose specific expression patterns appear at significantly higher frequencies in populations of centenarians and supercentenarians than in age-matched control populations. Research led by David Sinclair at Harvard Medical School has demonstrated that cellular aging processes regulated by NAD+ metabolism are theoretically modulable through interventions already demonstrated to extend healthy lifespan in model organisms by percentages significant enough to challenge the assumption that the human lifespan ceiling is biologically fixed rather than epigenetically regulated. More significantly for the antediluvian tradition, ancient DNA studies of prehistoric human populations have revealed that the genetic diversity of modern humans reflects at least two major bottleneck events that drastically reduced human population size, with the most recent associated with the Toba supervolcano eruption approximately 74,000 years ago. but with earlier bottlenecks appearing in the genetic record at intervals, suggesting that the genetic constitution of pre-catastrophe human populations may have differed in unknown, but potentially significant ways from the populations that rebuilt civilization after each reset event. The genetics of human aging has advanced with particular speed since the completion of the Human Genome Project in 2003 provided researchers with the full sequence of human DNA against which population variation studies could be conducted systematically. Studies of exceptionally long-lived populations, including the New England Centenarian Study, led by Thomas Pearls of Boston University Medical Center, and the Sardinian Blue Zone research conducted by Gianni Pes of the University of Sassari and Michel Poulain of the Catholic University of Louvain, have established that exceptional longevity, clusters within family lines, and geographical isolates in ways that strongly implicate genetic rather than purely environmental factors as primary determinants of lifespan in the upper ranges of human biological possibility. The FOXO3 gene, whose longevity-associated variant was identified in Japanese centenarian populations by Bradley Wilcox and colleagues in a 2008 study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, appears to regulate multiple cellular maintenance pathways simultaneously, including DNA repair, stress resistance, and metabolic efficiency, in ways that suggest the gene functions as a master regulator of biological aging rather than a single pathway modifier. The existence of such master regulatory genes means that relatively small changes in gene expression patterns could in principle produce dramatic changes in organismal lifespan without requiring wholesale alterations of human biology, providing a mechanistic framework within which the post-flood decline in the King List lifespan figures, interpreted as a gradual change in the genetic or epigenetic constitution of surviving populations following a catastrophic event, becomes biologically conceivable rather than simply impossible. The ancient DNA evidence that bears most directly on this question comes from studies of pre-Younger Dryas human populations, whose genetic constitution differed from modern populations in ways whose full significance is still being assessed. Wolfgang Haak of the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology and his colleagues, in a comprehensive 2015 study published in Nature analyzing ancient DNA from across Eurasia, demonstrated that modern European genetic diversity reflects multiple episodes of population replacement and admixture that fundamentally altered the genetic composition of European populations across the last 15,000 years. The population that occupied Europe before the Younger Dryas boundary left descendants whose genomic signature differs systematically from both the post-Younger Dryas hunter-gatherer populations and the later Neolithic farming communities that subsequently replaced them, indicating that the Younger Dryas catastrophe was associated with genuine population-level genetic discontinuity rather than mere cultural change. The pre-Younger Dryas populations, known to genetic researchers as Western hunter-gatherers or ancient North Eurasians depending on their precise geographical and temporal position, carried combinations of alleles at longevity-associated loci that differ from those found in subsequent populations, a difference whose significance for the question of antediluvian lifespan cannot yet be assessed quantitatively, but whose existence is an empirical fact established through rigorous ancient DNA analysis. The telomere length research conducted by Elizabeth Blackburn of the University of California at San Francisco, whose work on telomerase earned the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2009, established that the biological mechanisms governing cellular aging are more plastic than previously assumed, with telomere maintenance pathways capable of sustaining cellular division cycles far beyond the Hayflick limit that was formerly considered a fixed biological ceiling. Blackburn's demonstration that telomerase activation could extend cellular lifespan without triggering cancerous transformation in controlled experimental conditions suggested that the biochemical pathways governing organismal aging are not irreversibly constrained by any fundamental biological law, but represent evolved regulatory programs that could, in principle, be differently calibrated in populations with different genetic constitutions or different environmental histories. This does not prove that the antediluvian lifespans represent biological reality in the literal sense, but it does establish that the categorical biological impossibility of extended human lifespan, which conventional scholarship treats as self-evident, rests on assumptions about the fixed character of aging mechanisms that modern molecular biology has significantly undermined, removing the most fundamental scientific objection to taking the antediluvian tradition seriously as a record of something real rather than as mythology to be dismissed without analytical engagement. The question of biological possibility is in any case secondary to the question of whether the antediluvian figures are encoding individual biological lifespans at all. The mathematical analysis of those figures as SAR-based astronomical periods rather than biological ages remains the strongest interpretive framework regardless of what modern biology determines about theoretical longevity limits. The more immediately pressing question for historical analysis is not whether human beings could have lived for tens of thousands of years, but how information about astronomical cycles of that duration was encoded, preserved, and transmitted across the civilizational catastrophe that the King List places at its chronological center, a question whose answer the Mesopotamian textual tradition addresses in explicit and consistent terms that mainstream scholarship has been reluctant to take at face value. The very existence of the Sumerian King List raises a question that mainstream scholarship rarely addresses with adequate analytical rigor. How did detailed chronological information about a civilization that supposedly preceded the invention of writing by thousands of years survive in sufficient precision to be recorded in cuneiform tablets during the 3rd millennium before the Common Era? The standard answer that the King List represents retrospective mythology invented by later scribes to legitimize contemporary royal authority by projecting it into an imaginary distant past is fundamentally undermined by the mathematical precision of the antediluvian numbers, which require knowledge of astronomical cycles that cannot be invented by scribal mythographers, but must be calculated from extended observational programs spanning multiple generations and preserved with numerical fidelity across the transmission gap. The Mesopotamian textual tradition itself provides an explicit answer to the question of transmission that is rarely taken seriously by mainstream commentators. The Apkallu sages, the divine advisors of the antediluvian kings, were credited in multiple ancient sources with having deliberately preserved the knowledge of the pre-flood civilization through the catastrophe, not as a passive survival, but as an active institutional mission. The text known as the Beit Mesari, recovered from Neo-Assyrian temple libraries and analysed by Wilfred Lambert in studies published in the journal Iraq during the 1960s, describes how the Apkallu Utu Abzu, the 7th and final antediluvian sage, preserved the cosmic wisdom of the antediluvian period and ensured its transmission to post-flood civilization through human intermediaries specifically trained for this purpose, providing a consistent framework for understanding how precise mathematical and astronomical information encoded in the King List could have survived a civilizational catastrophe of the scale suggested by the Younger Dryas impact evidence. The Bitmeseri text, catalogued among the Neo-Assyrian ritual series preserved in Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh, and studied by Lambert in his two essential papers published in Iraq in 1962 and 1967, describes an elaborate system of protective rituals whose efficacy derives from invocation of the 7 antediluvian sages and their specific domains of knowledge. What makes the text relevant to the knowledge transmission question is not primarily its ritual content, but its explicit description of what happened to the sages' knowledge after the flood. The text describes Utu-Abzu, the 7th sage, as having ascended to heaven following the flood, but having first ensured the preservation of the cosmic wisdom he carried by encoding it within specific ritual formulas, architectural designs, and mathematical systems that he transmitted to selected human pupils who were trained to preserve and transmit them in turn. This description provides a mechanism for knowledge transmission that is functionally equivalent to the establishment of an oral tradition of the type known from other cultures to preserve complex technical information with extraordinary fidelity across extended periods of time, with the additional specificity that the information was encoded in forms designed for long-term preservation, rather than relying on simple narrative memory. The oral transmission of complex astronomical and mathematical knowledge across multiple generations has been documented in the ethnographic record for cultures ranging from the Aboriginal Australians, whose astronomical traditions analysed by Dwayne Hamaker of Monash University in multiple publications from 2010 onward encode precise records of stellar proper motion and variable star behaviour across periods of millennia, to the Polynesian navigators whose transmission of complex celestial navigation knowledge across generations of non-literate communities was analysed by David Lewis in his 1972 study We the Navigators. These documented cases of oral knowledge transmission demonstrate that complex quantitative information, including astronomical data requiring precise numerical encoding, can survive for periods of thousands of years within properly constituted institutional frameworks without the assistance of writing, provided the knowledge is embedded in mnemonic structures, ritual frameworks, or practical applications that give successive generations of custodians motivation to preserve it accurately. The antediluvian astronomical knowledge encoded in the King List's SAR-based reign durations is precisely the kind of information that such institutional transmission could have preserved from an observational and computational tradition predating the cuneiform writing system by the thousands of years that the Younger Dryas chronology requires. The archaeological evidence for pre-cuneiform knowledge institutions appears at sites including Göbekli Tepe, where the astronomical precision of the enclosure alignments and the deliberate burial of the site demonstrate the existence of organized communities with both the technical capability to encode astronomical knowledge in architectural form and the institutional coherence to make collective decisions about long-term knowledge preservation. The tradition of encoding astronomical knowledge in architectural alignments, found at Göbekli Tepe approximately 9,600 before the Common Era, and persisting in modified forms through the megalithic traditions of Europe, the pyramid complexes of Egypt and Mesoamerica, and the ziggurat architecture of Mesopotamia, represents exactly the kind of non-textual knowledge storage medium that the Bitmeseri's description of Utu-Abzu's preservation activities implies. The knowledge was not stored in texts that could be destroyed or lost. It was embedded in the proportions, alignments, and mathematical relationships of monumental structures that would persist across the civilizational disruptions that destroyed more fragile carriers of information. the institutions that preserved antediluvian astronomical knowledge in the post-flood period did not remain confined to Mesopotamia, but transmitted their frameworks through the mystery school traditions that became the primary vehicles of advanced knowledge transmission across the ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern worlds, and whose influence on the intellectual development of subsequent civilizations has been systematically underestimated by scholarship focused on conventional documentary sources. The antediluvian chronological framework preserved in the Sumerian King List did not disappear when cuneiform civilization declined after the Persian and Greek conquests of Mesopotamia. It entered a secondary phase of transmission through the mystery school traditions of the ancient Mediterranean world, where it was incorporated into cosmological frameworks that preserved its mathematical precision while adapting its cultural vocabulary to new religious and philosophical contexts, a process of encoded transmission that maintained the essential numerical relationships while making their origins increasingly opaque to uninitiated observers. The Pythagorean school, established by Pythagoras of Samos in the 6th century before the Common Era following his extended studies in Babylon and Egypt, preserved the sexagesimal mathematical framework of Mesopotamian astronomy within a philosophical system that treated numerical relationships as the fundamental structure of reality itself. The Pythagorean doctrine of the harmony of the spheres encoded planetary orbital relationships in precisely the mathematical ratios derived from the base 60 system, while the school's understanding of cosmic cycles preserved the precessional time calculations encoded in the antediluvian King List numbers within a metaphysical framework that allowed them to survive the collapse of the cuneiform scribal tradition. The Hermetic tradition, attributed to the legendary figure of Hermes Trismegistus, and preserved in texts including the Corpus Hermeticum and the Emerald Tablet, maintained explicit references to antediluvian civilizations and the deliberate preservation of their knowledge through catastrophic periods. The Hermetic document known as the Cor Cosmou describes how cosmic knowledge was inscribed on imperishable materials before a great flood and preserved for rediscovery by worthy initiates in subsequent ages, a motif that appears with remarkable consistency across mystery traditions ranging from the Egyptian priestly schools to the Jewish Kabbalistic tradition to the earliest documented Masonic symbolism, all of which preserve the core mathematical relationships of the antediluvian chronological system within their initiatory and symbolic frameworks. Iamblichus of Chalcis, the 4th century Neoplatonist philosopher whose biography of Pythagoras titled De Vita Pythagorica provides the most detailed ancient account of Pythagoras's intellectual formation, describes the sage as having spent 22 years studying in Egypt under the supervision of temple priests before being transported to Babylon following the Persian conquest of Egypt in 525 before the Common Era, where he spent an additional 12 years studying with the Chaldean astronomers of the Asagila temple complex. Whether these specific chronological details are accurate is less important than the consistent ancient tradition they represent, that Pythagoras derived his mathematical and astronomical knowledge from direct study with the institutional custodians of the Mesopotamian and Egyptian astronomical traditions, the same traditions that had preserved the antediluvian chronological framework across the millennia, separating the Younger Dryas catastrophe from the Hellenistic period, in which it was finally committed to the kind of textual form accessible to modern scholarship. The Pythagorean tetractys, the triangular arrangement of 10 points organized into rows of 1, 2, 3, and 4 that served as the central sacred symbol of the Pythagorean school, and around which elaborate philosophical doctrines were organized, encodes in its arithmetic structure the ratios 4 to 3 to 2 to 1 that are the structural ratios of the Hindu Yuga system and the harmonic series embedded in the Mesopotamian antediluvian chronological framework, a coincidence whose significance is not accidental, but reflects the common mathematical origin of all three systems in the astronomical knowledge, preserved through the antediluvian transmission. The Eleusinian mysteries, whose initiations at the sanctuary of Eleusis near Athens were conducted for approximately 2,000 years, from approximately 1400 before the Common Era to 392 of the Common Era, represent the longest-running documented institutional framework for preserving non-textual knowledge in the ancient Mediterranean world. The content of the Eleusinian initiations was protected by oaths of secrecy, so effective that despite the participation of virtually every major Greek intellectual and political figure of the classical period, including Plato, Aristotle, and Cicero, no complete account of the inner teachings has survived to the present day. The few surviving fragments, including the Homeric hymn to Demeter and the scattered references in Plato's dialogues, indicate that the mysteries concerned the nature of cyclical time, the relationship between astronomical cycles and human life cycles, and the possibility of transcending the limitations of ordinary mortality, themes whose convergence with the antediluvian traditions of exceptional longevity and cosmic time cycles encoded in the King List is not coincidental, but reflects the common intellectual heritage that the mystery schools were designed to preserve and transmit. The Kabbalistic tradition within Judaism provides a particularly clear example of how the mathematical relationships encoded in the antediluvian chronological system were preserved within religious frameworks that gave no overt indication of their astronomical content. The Sefer Yetzirah, the earliest extant Kabbalistic text, whose composition is dated by scholars including Gershom Scholem of Hebrew University to approximately the 3rd century of the Common Era, but which preserves traditions of considerably greater antiquity, organizes its cosmological framework around the numbers 3, 7, and 12, corresponding to the 3 mother letters, 7 double letters, and 12 simple letters of the Hebrew alphabet, through which creation is described as having been structured. 3 times 7 is 21, 7 times 12 is 84, 21 times 12 is 252. All of these numbers are divisors or multiples of the fundamental processional numbers embedded in the antediluvian King List, and their systematic deployment within a theological framework that appears to have no astronomical motivation indicates that the mathematical relationships were being preserved through their incorporation into structures whose surface content made no reference to their astronomical origins. The same strategy of embedded encoding that the King List itself employs. The modern validation of the mathematical frameworks preserved through these traditions comes not from the mystery schools themselves, but from the astrophysics and planetary science of the past half-century, which has independently arrived at conclusions about the periodicity and character of cosmic catastrophes that align with remarkable precision with the ancient chronological frameworks. The interpretation of the Sumerian King List as an astronomical encoding system, rather than a conventional historical document, has received unexpected support from developments in modern astrophysics and planetary science that vindicate ancient claims about cosmic cycles operating on the precise timescales encoded in the antediluvian numbers, lending the encoding hypothesis a degree of scientific grounding that it lacked when first proposed by researchers, including Giorgio de Santillana and Hertha von der Chend, in their 1969 work Hamlet's Mill. The phenomenon of the galactic year, the period required for the solar system to complete one orbit around the centre of the Milky Way galaxy, has been calculated by modern astronomers using parallax measurements and radial velocity data at approximately 225 to 250 million years, a period whose mathematical relationship to the precession cycle of 25,920 years can be expressed as precise multiples of the same base numbers encoded in the Sumerian antediluvian King List, suggesting that the ancient mathematical framework was designed to track astronomical phenomena operating at galactic as well as precessional scales. More immediately relevant is the growing body of evidence for periodic comet showers associated with the solar system's oscillation through the galactic plane, a cycle of approximately 32 million years studied by Victor Klube and Bill Napier of the Royal Observatory Edinburgh, who argued in their analysis of the Taurid meteor complex that fragmentation events within large progenitor comets produce periodic episodes of enhanced bombardment that correlate with catastrophic events in both the geological and historical record, providing astrophysical grounding for the ancient traditions of cyclical cosmic catastrophe that the Sumerian King List's mathematical structure appears specifically designed to track and remember across multiple cycles of civilizational disruption and renewal. Victor Klube and Bill Napier developed their coherent catastrophism hypothesis across multiple publications, beginning with their 1982 book, The Cosmic Serpent, and continuing through The Cosmic Winter, published in 1990, arguing on the basis of orbital dynamics analysis and cometary fragmentation modelling that the Taurid meteor complex, the debris stream associated with the periodic comet Encke, and several related bodies, represents the remnants of a much larger progenitor comet that entered the inner solar system approximately 20,000 to 30,000 years ago and has been fragmenting progressively since that time. Their models predicted that the Earth would experience episodes of enhanced bombardment from Taurid complex debris at intervals of approximately 3,000 years, as the planet's orbit intersects denser concentrations of material within the debris stream, a prediction that correlates with identified episodes of catastrophic disruption in the archaeological and paleoclimatological record, including the Younger Dryas impact event approximately 12,900 years ago, a similar but less severe episode approximately 8,200 years ago, known as the 8.2 kiloyear event, and additional disturbance episodes at roughly 3,000-year intervals that correlate with the collapses of the Bronze Age civilizations around 1200, before the Common Era, and with other historically documented episodes of widespread civilizational disruption. The 3,000-year interval between bombardment episodes identified by Klube and Napier's modelling corresponds with a precision that demands acknowledgement to the SAR unit of 3,600 years that the Sumerian antediluvian chronological framework uses as its fundamental large time unit. The mathematical relationship is not exact, but it is sufficiently close to raise the serious question of whether the SAR was chosen as a unit not because of its relationship to the square of 60 in the abstract, but because it approximated the actual periodicity of the cosmic catastrophe cycle that the antediluvian tradition was designed to track and remember. A civilization that had survived a previous bombardment episode and understood from astronomical analysis that such events recurred at approximately SR scale intervals would have strong motivation to encode that interval in its chronological framework in a way that would be preserved and recognized by future civilizations that encountered the same cycle, exactly the function that the King List's mathematical structure appears designed to serve, The confirmation of the Younger Dryas impact event by the research teams of Kennett and Firestone, published between 2007 and 2018 across multiple peer-reviewed journals, provided the first direct physical evidence for a specific cosmic bombardment event within the historical range of modern human civilization that matches the description of the flood catastrophe in ancient traditions. The subsequent identification of a similar though less severe impact signal at approximately 5,200 years ago, reported by Christopher Moore of the University of South Carolina and colleagues in a 2019 study published in Scientific Reports, places a second bombardment episode within the historical period covered by the antediluvian King List, providing physical confirmation for the ancient tradition's description of recurring cosmic catastrophes at intervals consistent with the SAR-based framework. The astrophysical evidence for periodic bombardment, the geological evidence for the Younger Dryas catastrophe, and the mathematical structure of the antediluvian chronological framework all converge on a model in which the King List was not recording mythological events but encoding astronomical and historical information about real catastrophic cycles that modern science is only now beginning to understand and confirm. The gravitational wave observations conducted by the Laser Interferometer Gravitational Wave Observatory Collaboration, whose first detection of gravitational waves from merging black holes was announced in February of 2016, have opened a new observational window on the large-scale structure of the universe that may eventually provide means of testing aspects of the ancient cosmological frameworks that previously could not be empirically evaluated. The mathematical relationships between orbital periods, galactic rotation cycles, and cosmic timescales that the antediluvian numbers encode through their nested multiples of 432,000 are precisely the relationships that gravitational wave astronomy is beginning to constrain observationally, creating the possibility that the ancient mathematical framework will eventually be validated or refuted through direct observational test, rather than through the indirect astronomical and geological evidence that currently supports its interpretation as an accurate encoding of real cosmic cycles. The trajectory of confirmation from the mathematical analysis of the King List numbers through the geological validation of the Younger Dryas impact to the astrophysical confirmation of periodic bombardment cycles has moved consistently in the direction of validating rather than refuting the astronomical encoding hypothesis, and the same direction of travel characterizes the broader pattern of archaeological and scientific discovery that bears on the question of what human civilization achieved before the catastrophe the King List marks at its chronological centre. The cumulative weight of the evidence examined across this investigation points toward a conclusion that mainstream archaeology resists, but that the data systematically supports from multiple independent directions. The Sumerian King List is not mythology in the conventional sense of that word. It is an encoded chronological document that preserves precise astronomical and historical information about a period of human civilization that predates the conventional origin point of urban society by a margin. The evidence is not yet sufficient to specify precisely, encoded in mathematical language specifically designed to survive, the kinds of catastrophic civilizational disruptions that the geological record confirms have periodically interrupted human development. The precision of the antediluvian numbers, their consistent mathematical relationship to the SAR cycle and precessional astronomy, their appearance in structurally identical form across traditions in Mesopotamia, India, Scandinavia, and the biblical record with no documented pathway of direct transmission, The archaeological evidence for sophisticated prehistoric civilization at sites like Göbekli Tepe and the 5 antediluvian cities of the King List itself, the geological evidence for catastrophic flooding and climate collapse at the Younger Dryas boundary, and the consistent global distribution of flood traditions containing matching technical details all converge on the same conclusion. The civilizational break described in the Sumerian King List between antediluvian and post-diluvian humanity was real, measurable, and not the product of mythological imagination. The implications extend far beyond the academic question of when Mesopotamian civilization began. If the antediluvian numbers encode actual historical periods measured in cosmic astronomical cycles, then the civilization they describe possessed sophisticated astronomical knowledge, mathematical capability, and institutional historical consciousness. Thousands of years before conventional timelines allow for any of these capacities, suggesting that the trajectory of human intellectual and technological development has been far more complex and far more cyclical in its pattern of achievement and catastrophic loss than the progressive developmental model that has dominated Western archaeological thinking since the 19th century allows us to consider. The resistance that these conclusions encounter within mainstream academic institutions reflects less a considered assessment of the evidence than a structural feature of specialized scholarly disciplines that are not designed to integrate findings across the boundaries separating archaeology, astronomy, geology, genetics, and comparative mythology into a coherent synthesis. Each of these disciplines, examined in isolation, produces findings that conventional frameworks within that discipline can accommodate without radical revision. It is only when the findings are assembled across disciplinary boundaries and examined for their mutual implications that the picture that emerges challenges conventional understanding with the force that the evidence presented throughout this investigation warrants. The clay tablets of ancient Mesopotamia have been available to scholarly analysis for more than 150 years. The mathematical structure of the antediluvian reign lengths has been visible in every published transliteration of the King List since Jacobson's 1939 edition. What has been lacking is not the evidence, but the analytical framework capable of recognizing what the evidence means. That analytical framework is now available. The combination of Klube and Napier's periodic bombardment hypothesis, the physical confirmation of the Younger Dryas impact, the ancient DNA evidence for pre-catastrophe population discontinuity, the archaeoastronomical analysis of sites like Göbekli Tepe, and the mathematical analysis of the King List numerical structure in relation to precessional and galactic astronomical cycles, provides for the first time a coherent synthesis within which the antediluvian tradition makes sense not as mythology, but as history, a history encoded in the most durable language available to a civilization that understood it might not survive in recognizable form, but determined that its knowledge should. The Weld-Blundell Prism, sitting in its case at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, is not a mythological curiosity. It is a message, encoded in the mathematical language of cosmic time, from a civilization that preceded our own, and that knew enough about the cycles it was tracking to know that the message would eventually be read by someone capable of understanding it. What we do with that understanding, in the context of a civilization that faces environmental, technological, and social challenges whose character ancient traditions consistently describe as the signature conditions of a civilizational threshold moment, may be the most consequential question that the investigation of human prehistory has ever placed before us. The evidence assembled across this investigation does not merely suggest a revision to conventional timelines of human development. it demands a fundamental reconception of what human civilization is, how long it has existed, and what has repeatedly interrupted its continuity. The Sumerian King List, the mathematical convergence of 432,000 across Mesopotamian, Hindu and Norse traditions, the astronomical precision of Göbekli Tepe's enclosure alignments, the platinum anomaly in the Younger Dryas boundary layer, the flood deposits beneath Woolley's excavations at Ur, the categorical distinction between antediluvian and post-diluvian Apkallu in the Bitmeseri text, and the molecular biology evidence for genetic discontinuity at catastrophic boundaries are not independent curiosities belonging to separate academic specialties. They are convergent lines of evidence pointing toward a single coherent conclusion that the progressive developmental model of human history was never adequate to the full complexity of the human past. The civilization that encoded its astronomical knowledge in the SAR-based reign lengths of the Sumerian King List understood something that our own civilization is only beginning to recover, that cosmic catastrophes recur on timescales that individual human lifespans cannot perceive, but that institutional memory organized around the right mathematical framework can track across millennia. The encoding of the precessional cycle, the SAR unit, and the 432,000-year total in a document designed to be copied by every generation of scribal students was not an act of mythological invention. It was an act of civilizational preservation, the deliberate embedding of the most important information a society possessed into the most durable and widely distributed medium available, ensuring that whoever survived the next catastrophe and whatever writing system they eventually developed would eventually be able to read the message and understand its implications. The mystery schools that carried fragments of this knowledge from the collapse of cuneiform civilization through the Hellenistic, Roman and medieval periods into the modern world were not secret societies in the pejorative sense of that phrase. They were the institutional successors of the Apkallu tradition, communities of custodians who understood that certain kinds of knowledge require protection, not because they are dangerous, but because they are too important to be lost to the indifference of populations that have not yet recovered sufficient civilizational capability to recognize their value. The knowledge they preserved is now recoverable through the convergence of modern scientific methods with ancient textual traditions, and the recovery is happening precisely at the moment when our own civilization faces the kinds of environmental, technological, and social challenges that the ancient traditions consistently identify as the characteristic conditions preceding a civilizational threshold. We are not the first people to have reached this threshold. The Weld-Blundell Prism tells us so in the only language precise enough to survive the distance between that world and ours, the language of numbers, of astronomical cycles, and of mathematical relationships that remain true regardless of what catastrophe intervenes between the civilization that encodes them and the civilization that finally reads them. The question before us now is whether we'll be the first to read the message clearly enough to choose differently than those who encoded it,